And that brings us back to the inscriptions. Why record medical knowledge? Why preserve formulas? Why write down titles? Because knowledge had value. And in ancient Egypt, knowledge could become part of a person's identity. A physician was not merely someone who knew how to mix herbs. He was someone trusted with knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death. A royal physician would have had even greater status. The possibility that Teti Nebfu served the royal court makes his tomb even more intriguing. Imagine the secrets he may have known, the illnesses of powerful officials, the treatments used inside the palace, the plants considered valuable, the rituals used against poison, the medical problems suffered by members of the royal family. Perhaps he treated the same people whose names now dominate history. Perhaps he stood close to the pharaoh while the political world around him changed. We may never know. His tomb does not give us every answer. Instead, it gives us fragments. And fragments can be more mysterious than complete stories. Because when the evidence is incomplete, questions multiply. Why was the tomb robbed? When did the body disappear? Was the tomb deliberately disturbed? Was Teti Nebfu buried elsewhere? Were objects removed by thieves, priests, or later officials? And why did so much of the wall decoration survive when the human remains did not? The desert has a strange way of preserving some things while destroying others. Stone survives, pigment survives, names survive. Bodies sometimes disappear. It is almost as if the tomb itself chose what to remember. But perhaps there is another reason the inscriptions survived. The Egyptians designed many of their sacred texts to last. They carved words into durable stone. They repeated names. They covered walls with images. They surrounded the deceased with symbols intended to preserve their identity forever. They were fighting time with architecture. And for thousands of years it worked, until modern archaeologists arrived. Suddenly, the silence was broken. The symbols were photographed. The walls were documented. The names were read. And a man who had been dead for more than 4 millennia was given a voice again. But the more we understand his inscriptions, the more we begin to see the larger world behind them. A world where doctors could be healers and priests, where scorpions could be symbols of death and protection, where medicine could involve herbs and sacred words, where a tomb could function as both a burial chamber and a spiritual machine, and where the dead were expected to continue living somewhere beyond the reach of the Nile. That belief explains something else. Why the Egyptians went to such extraordinary lengths to preserve the body. Because if the body was damaged, what happened to the person? The answer leads directly into the world of mummification. And that is where the ancient Egyptians may have developed their most extraordinary attempt to defeat death. They did not simply bury their dead. They tried to make death temporary. And the methods they developed would preserve some human beings for thousands of years. But the process began with something surprisingly simple: salt. And what happened next would transform an ordinary human body into a message from the ancient world. The first thing ancient Egyptian embalmers had to defeat was not death itself. It was decay. The moment a human being dies, the body begins to change. Cells break down. Bacteria multiply. Tissues deteriorate. Within a relatively short time, the person who once walked, spoke, ate, and breathed begins to disappear. But the ancient Egyptians looked at this process differently. They saw decay as a threat to eternity. If the body was destroyed, what would happen to the person who was supposed to live beyond death? So they developed one of the most extraordinary preservation traditions in human history: mummification. For thousands of years, Egyptian embalmers refined techniques designed to slow decomposition and preserve the appearance of the deceased. The process could take around 70 days, and it was not simply a matter of wrapping a body in cloth. It was a carefully organized ritual. The body was prepared. The internal organs were removed or treated. The tissues were dried. The body was treated with resins and oils. Then layer after layer of linen was wrapped around it. Every step had both a physical and religious purpose. The physical goal was preservation. The spiritual goal was resurrection. And this distinction is crucial. The Egyptians did not believe that preserving a body would magically bring it back to life in the ordinary sense. They believed the preserved body was necessary for the continued existence of the deceased in the afterlife. The person had crossed a boundary, but the body still mattered. That belief explains why Egyptian tombs could be filled with extraordinary objects. Food, clothing, jewelry, perfumes, furniture, weapons, games, tools, even boats. It was as if the Egyptians were trying to recreate an entire world around the dead. King Tutankhamun's tomb provides perhaps the most famous example. When Howard Carter entered the tomb in 1922, he found something archaeologists had almost stopped expecting to see: a royal burial chamber containing an extraordinary collection of objects. Nested coffins, gold, furniture, weapons, chariots, walking sticks, food, containers, jewelry, and finally, the king himself. But the discovery of Tutankhamun's mummy also revealed something that is often overlooked. Preservation was never perfect. The oils and resins used during the burial had reacted chemically over the centuries. Some materials hardened, others degraded. The mummy became extremely fragile. When researchers eventually attempted to examine the body, they encountered a terrible problem. The mummy had become stuck to the coffin. The materials used to protect the king had effectively turned into a hardened adhesive, and the examination became a battle between knowledge and preservation. How do you study something that could be destroyed simply by touching it? This is one of the biggest challenges archaeologists face today. The ancient Egyptians wanted their dead to remain untouched forever. Modern researchers want to understand them. Those goals can sometimes conflict. Tutankhamun is a perfect example. Researchers wanted to know what happened to him. How old was he? What diseases did he suffer from? How did he die? Who were his parents? What did he look like? What happened to his body after death? But answering those questions required interacting with the mummy. And every interaction carries a risk. This is why modern archaeology has increasingly turned toward technology. Instead of unwrapping every mummy, researchers can use CT scans, X-rays, and other imaging techniques. The result is astonishing. Without cutting through the linen, scientists can sometimes see the skeleton. They can examine the skull. They can identify fractures. They can locate objects hidden inside wrappings. They can even reconstruct three-dimensional images of the body. In some cases, these scans reveal details that ancient embalmers never intended anyone to see. The Field Museum in Chicago, for example, used advanced CT scanning to examine Egyptian mummies without physically unwrapping them. The process produced thousands of X-ray images. When those images were combined, researchers could create three-dimensional views of the remains. Suddenly, the mummy became more than an object in a display case. It became a medical record, a biological archive, a human being whose body had survived long enough to tell a story. One of the most fascinating examples is the mummy known as Lady Chinet Ah. She lived roughly 3,000 years ago. Researchers estimate that she died somewhere in her late 30s or early 40s. Her embalmers carefully prepared her body for the afterlife. They inserted material into her neck to prevent it from collapsing. They placed artificial eyes into her sockets. They wrapped her in fine linen. They placed her inside an elaborately decorated coffin. The coffin itself contained a carefully designed opening that allowed the body to be positioned inside. To us, these details might seem strange. but they reveal something fundamental. The Egyptians were not trying to preserve only a skeleton. They were trying to preserve the person, the face, the appearance, the physical identity, because the afterlife was imagined as a continuation of existence, not a completely different state where the individual became unrecognizable. This is why the Egyptians cared so much about appearance. The body needed to remain identifiable. The name needed to remain visible. The tomb needed to contain images. The deceased needed to be surrounded by familiar objects. Everything was connected. Body, name, memory, identity, and eternity. But not every mummy was created through deliberate embalming. Some of the oldest preserved bodies in Egypt were created naturally. The desert itself could act as an embalmer. Hot, dry sand could rapidly remove moisture from a corpse. And without enough moisture, bacteria and other organisms struggled to break down tissue. This natural process may have influenced the development of deliberate mummification. Long before Egyptian embalmers perfected their techniques, nature had already demonstrated something important. Dryness could preserve the dead. One famous example is ginger, a naturally preserved Egyptian body dating back roughly 5,000 years. He was buried in the desert, where the dry environment helped prevent decomposition. His body survived for millennia, and when researchers eventually examined him, they were looking at a human being who lived long before the Great Pyramids became the symbol of Egypt. Ginger is important because he reminds us that mummification did not appear out of nowhere. The Egyptians may have observed what the desert naturally did to bodies. Then they gradually learned how to reproduce and improve the effect. Over generations, preservation became a science of its own. But Egypt was not the only place where humans discovered how to preserve the dead. Across the world, bodies were naturally or deliberately mummified under very different conditions. Extreme cold, extreme dryness, lack of oxygen, chemical environments, special burial practices. One of the most famous examples is Ötzi, the Iceman. When his frozen body was discovered in the Alps in 1991, researchers initially believed they had found a relatively modern mountaineer. The body was simply too well preserved. But then the evidence revealed something extraordinary. Ötzi had died more than 5,000 years ago. He belonged to the Copper Age. His body had been naturally preserved by ice, and his remains provided an extraordinary record of prehistoric life. Researchers discovered evidence of arthritis, vascular problems, intestinal parasites, dietary information, old injuries. His tools revealed what he carried. His body revealed what he ate. Even the contents of his stomach provided clues about his final days. He became a frozen time capsule. And that is exactly what a mummy can be. A time capsule. It can preserve information that no written document can provide. Written records can tell us what people believed. Mummies can tell us what happened to their bodies. Bones can reveal physical stress. Teeth can reveal diet. Hair can preserve chemical traces. Stomach contents can reveal meals. Trauma can reveal violence. Disease can reveal the dangers of everyday life. And sometimes, the evidence contradicts the stories written by the living. That is what makes mummies so valuable. They do not care about reputation. A king can describe himself as powerful. A monument can describe a ruler as victorious. An inscription can praise a pharaoh as chosen by the gods. But a skeleton cannot flatter anyone. It records what happened to the body. And sometimes what researchers find is surprisingly ordinary. Ancient rulers suffered from disease. They experienced injuries. They had dental problems. They aged. They died. Even the most powerful pharaoh was still human. Ramses II is a perfect example. He ruled for decades. He built monuments across Egypt. He led military campaigns. He became one of the most famous rulers of the ancient world. But his mummy reveals something much more human. He experienced the physical effects of old age. His body survived, but it could not escape time. Eventually, even a man who had ruled Egypt for nearly 7 decades became a preserved body in a museum. And that may be the most unsettling lesson of all. The ancient Egyptians built pyramids because they wanted eternity. They carved names into stone because they feared forgetting. They preserved bodies because they believed existence could continue. But thousands of years later, the evidence tells us something different. No matter how powerful the person was, the body still changed. The tomb still decayed. The treasures still disappeared. And yet, something survived. The story, the name, the memory, the message. Perhaps that was the real victory the Egyptians achieved. They could not defeat death, but they came remarkably close to defeating oblivion. And somewhere inside the silent walls of an ancient tomb, another message was waiting to tell us exactly what they believed would happen when the body finally failed. For thousands of years, the Egyptians believed death was not the end. It was a passage, a dangerous journey into another world. And if the dead wanted to survive that journey, they needed more than a preserved body. They needed instructions. They needed protection. They needed to know the names of things waiting in the darkness. And that is where the mysterious texts buried inside Egyptian tombs become truly fascinating. Because the walls of these tombs were not simply decorated, they were written. Every symbol had a purpose. Every image could carry meaning. Every spell could be part of a much larger system designed to guide the dead through the afterlife. To modern eyes, the hieroglyphs may look like beautiful pictures. Birds, eyes, hands, snakes, crowns, boats, human figures, strange creatures. But to the ancient Egyptians, these symbols were much more than decoration. They could represent sounds, words, ideas, names, and sometimes entire concepts. A single inscription could transform a silent tomb into a kind of spiritual map. The deceased was expected to travel through dangerous regions after death. There were gates to pass, guardians to confront, creatures to avoid, names to remember, words that had to be spoken correctly. And if the dead person knew the correct spells, the journey could continue. If they did not, the consequences could be terrifying. This belief helps explain why Egyptian tombs were covered with texts. The walls were almost like an ancient survival manual. But there was another important reason. The Egyptians believed that words themselves had power. Writing a thing could help make it real. Naming something could give control over it. And destroying a name could threaten a person's existence. This is why names were so important. A person's identity did not simply disappear when they died. As long as the name was spoken and remembered, part of that person continued to exist. That belief may explain one of the most disturbing practices in Egyptian history: the deliberate destruction of names. When rulers wanted to erase someone from history, they sometimes removed their name from monuments. Images were damaged. Inscriptions were altered. Statues were destroyed. It was more than political revenge. In the ancient Egyptian worldview, it could become an attack on eternity itself. If nobody remembered you, did you still exist? That question appears again and again in Egyptian culture. And it takes us directly to one of the most important collections of funerary writings ever discovered: the pyramid texts. These texts were carved inside the pyramids of Old Kingdom rulers. They contain spells, religious formulas, hymns, and instructions intended to help the dead king reach the afterlife. Some passages describe the king ascending toward the heavens. Others connect him with the gods. Some describe dangerous supernatural beings. Others focus on food, protection, transformation, and resurrection. The extraordinary thing is that these texts are among the oldest known religious writings in the world, and they reveal something unexpected. Egyptian beliefs about death were not simple. There was no single Egyptian idea of the afterlife. The beliefs evolved over thousands of years. Different periods produced different texts. Different traditions emphasized different gods. And ordinary people gradually gained access to funerary knowledge that had once been strongly associated with kings. Eventually, funerary spells began appearing inside coffins. This collection became known as the coffin texts. Later came another famous collection, the Book of the Dead. Despite the name, it was not really a single book. It was a collection of spells and illustrations that could be selected and arranged for an individual burial. Some versions were short, others were enormous. The contents could vary depending on the person's status, wealth, and beliefs. And that tells us something important. The Egyptians were not simply copying a fixed religious manual. They were customizing the journey into the afterlife. The dead needed the right knowledge, the right protection, the right words, and perhaps most importantly, the right identity. One of the most famous scenes associated with Egyptian funerary beliefs shows what happened after death. The deceased stands before Osiris. But before reaching him, the dead person must face judgment. The heart is placed on a scale. On the other side is the feather of Ma'at. Ma'at represented truth, balance, justice, and cosmic order. The heart had to be light enough. If the person's life had been honorable, the heart would remain balanced. If the heart was weighed down by wrongdoing, the consequences could be horrifying. A monstrous creature waited nearby, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Its name is often translated as Amit, the devourer. If the heart failed the judgment, Amit would consume it. The deceased would lose the chance to continue into the afterlife. This idea is fascinating because it turns the Egyptian afterlife into something more than a journey through a supernatural landscape. It becomes a moral test. The dead person was not simply trying to survive. They were trying to prove that they deserved to continue. And that may be one reason the Egyptians spent so much effort preparing their dead. The tomb became a place of protection. The mummy became the physical anchor. The inscriptions became instructions. The offerings became supplies. The gods became guardians. Everything had a role. Even the smallest object could carry meaning. A scarab amulet, for example, could represent rebirth. The scarab beetle was associated with the rising sun and the cycle of renewal. An amulet placed on a mummy was not merely jewelry. It could serve as protection. Some were positioned carefully over specific parts of the body. Others were shaped into symbols associated with particular gods or ideas. And among the most important was the heart scarab. The heart was considered extremely important in Egyptian thought. Unlike modern medicine, ancient Egyptians did not understand the brain as the center of thought and consciousness. The heart held a much greater role. It was connected to intelligence, emotion, character, and moral judgment. That is why protecting the heart was so important. The Egyptians feared that the deceased's own heart might testify against them. Imagine carrying the record of your entire life inside your chest, and then having to place it on a divine scale. That was the terrifying logic behind the judgment of the dead. But Egyptian funerary beliefs become even stranger when we look at the journey itself. The afterlife was not necessarily imagined as a peaceful paradise immediately after death. The deceased could encounter darkness, water, gates, fire, serpents, guardians, and supernatural beings. Some texts describe the sun god traveling through the underworld during the night. Every evening, the sun disappeared. Every morning it returned. To the Egyptians, this daily cycle was a perfect symbol of death and resurrection. The sun appeared to die every evening, then return at dawn. Osiris represented a similar cycle. He was murdered, dismembered, restored, and transformed into the ruler of the dead. His story provided a powerful model for the deceased. If Osiris could overcome death, perhaps ordinary humans could too. This explains why Egyptian tomb art often contains images of resurrection. The dead person might be shown standing again, eating, drinking, working, meeting family members, sailing across the heavens, entering the presence of the gods. The tomb was not designed to represent death as permanent darkness. It was designed to represent continuation. But there was a problem. What if the tomb was destroyed? What if the mummy disappeared? What if thieves entered? What if the name was forgotten? The Egyptians knew these dangers existed, and history proved them right. Thousands of tombs were robbed. Mummies were damaged. Royal burials were moved. Treasures disappeared. Names were erased. Even the greatest pharaohs could not completely protect their tombs. Ramses II's original burial was eventually disturbed. His mummy was moved and hidden with other royal remains in a secret cache. Centuries later, archaeologists rediscovered it. The same thing happened to other royal mummies. Their original tombs had been violated, so priests moved their bodies to safer locations. Ironically, the effort to protect them eventually made their final resting places harder to identify. And this brings us back to the strange discovery of the tomb of Thutmose II. When archaeologists finally identified his long-lost tomb, they expected to find the remains of a royal burial. Instead, the tomb was empty. At first, that sounds like another robbery. But the evidence suggested something else. The tomb had been damaged by flooding. Water had entered the structure. Artifacts had been moved. And a second corridor may have been created to help remove the king's burial. The tomb had essentially become unsafe soon after it was constructed. Imagine the scene. A royal burial prepared with rituals, inscriptions, and sacred objects. Then nature intervenes. Water enters. Walls weaken. Artifacts are damaged. The body must be moved. The tomb that was supposed to protect the king for eternity becomes a danger to his remains. And suddenly, the ancient Egyptian obsession with preservation makes perfect sense. They were fighting two enemies: time and nature. But there was another enemy they could never fully control: human curiosity. Thousands of years later, archaeologists enter these tombs. They shine lights into chambers that have not been seen for centuries. They brush sand from inscriptions. They scan coffins. They photograph mummies. They translate words that were written for the dead, but somehow survived long enough to speak to the living. And sometimes those words contain something unexpected: a warning, a ritual, a name, a forgotten belief, or a message that appears to describe something far stranger than we ever imagined. The deeper archaeologists go into Egypt's ancient record, the clearer one thing becomes. The Egyptians were obsessed with death because they were obsessed with life. They wanted to understand what made a person a person. They wanted identity to survive. They wanted memory to survive. They wanted the name to survive. And perhaps most importantly, they wanted the story to survive. Because if a person could still be named thousands of years after death, then maybe they had not disappeared completely. Their body might become dust. Their gold might be stolen. Their tomb might collapse. Their civilization might vanish. But their words could remain, waiting in the darkness, waiting for someone to find them, waiting for someone to understand. And sometimes, when those ancient words are finally decoded, they reveal that the Egyptians were not simply describing the world of the dead. They were warning the living about what could happen when the boundary between those two worlds was crossed. For more than 3,000 years, these symbols remained silent. They were carved into stone by people who believed the words could protect the dead, guide them through the underworld, and perhaps even control what happened after death. Today, archaeologists can finally read many of them. And some of the messages are far darker than anyone would expect. Imagine standing inside an ancient Egyptian tomb. The entrance is behind you. The outside world has disappeared. There is no sound except your own breathing. Your flashlight moves across the walls, revealing rows of strange figures. A bird, a snake, an eye, a seated man, a hand, a sun disk, a mysterious creature with a human body and an animal head. At first, it looks like a collection of beautiful pictures. But then you realize something. The walls are talking. Every symbol belongs to a language. Every line was carved with intention. And some of these inscriptions were never meant for you. They were meant for the dead. This is one of the strangest things about ancient Egyptian writing. The hieroglyphic system was not simply a way to record ordinary conversations. It was deeply connected with religion, kingship, magic, and the afterlife. The Egyptians believed that written words possessed power. A name written correctly could preserve a person's existence. A protective formula could defend a body. A spell could help the dead pass through a dangerous region of the underworld. And a curse could threaten anyone who violated a sacred burial. This is where the famous idea of the Egyptian curse comes from. Hollywood transformed these ancient warnings into stories about mummies rising from their tombs and killing explorers. The reality was more complicated. Most Egyptian tombs did not contain supernatural traps. But some inscriptions did contain warnings. They could threaten punishment from the gods. They could warn against disturbing a burial. They could call upon divine forces to protect the deceased. And in a world where religion was not separated from everyday life, these words were not jokes. They were serious. To an ancient Egyptian, entering a sealed tomb without permission was not simply trespassing. It could be an attack on the eternal existence of another human being. The tomb was a sacred space. The mummy was not simply a corpse. The objects around it were not random possessions. Everything had a purpose. And the inscriptions helped connect the entire system. One of the most important concepts was the person's name. The ancient Egyptians believed that a human being had several spiritual components. Among them were the Ka and the Ba. The Ka was associated with the person's life force. The Ba was often represented as a human-headed bird and was connected with the individual's personality and movement between worlds. The preserved body provided another essential connection. Then there was the name. The name was part of identity. Remove the name, and you threatened the person's existence. This is why ancient Egyptian rulers sometimes tried to destroy the names of their enemies. One of the most famous examples involves Hatshepsut. She became one of Egypt's most successful female rulers. She expanded trade. She sponsored enormous building projects. She filled Egypt with monuments celebrating her reign. But after her death, parts of her legacy were attacked. Her name and images were removed from some monuments. For centuries, this helped obscure her identity. But the attempt failed. Archaeologists eventually reconstructed the evidence. The woman whose name had been attacked returned to history. The dead had been silenced. But not forever. And that is the strange irony of Egyptian history. The ancient Egyptians believed destroying a person's name could threaten their eternal existence. Thousands of years later, archaeologists are doing the opposite. They are recovering forgotten names. They are restoring damaged inscriptions. They are translating forgotten words. They are bringing people back into the historical record. One of those forgotten figures was the ancient physician whose tomb was discovered near Saqqara. His name was Teti Neb Fu. His tomb had been robbed. His body was gone. The treasures had disappeared. Yet the inscriptions survived. And those inscriptions revealed something remarkable about the man. He was not simply a doctor. He held several rare titles. He was associated with medicinal plants. He was connected with the treatment of dangerous bites and stings. And he was described as a chief dentist. His tomb became a kind of medical record carved into stone. Of years after his death, the words told us what kind of knowledge he possessed. This is why hieroglyphs matter. They do more than tell us what happened. They can reveal how ancient people understood the world, what they feared, what they valued, what they believed could heal them, what they believed could destroy them, and what they believed waited after death. But there is an even more fascinating aspect of Egyptian writing. Some inscriptions were designed to be spoken. The Egyptians believed that sound could activate meaning. A written spell was powerful, but speaking the words could make them active in a ritual context. This means that some tombs were essentially designed as silent scripts waiting for a voice. The dead person was surrounded by instructions, names, commands, prayers, descriptions, and protective formulas. The walls were prepared for a journey that nobody living could witness, the journey through the underworld. One of the most important funerary traditions described the sun god Ra traveling through the underworld every night. The sun disappeared beyond the horizon. To the Egyptians, this was not simply the end of daylight. It was a journey. Ra entered the realm of darkness. There he encountered dangerous beings and enemies. But eventually, he emerged again. The sun returned. A new day began. This daily cycle became one of the most powerful symbols in Egyptian religion. Death was not necessarily the end. It could be a transition. Darkness could lead to renewal. And the dead could potentially follow the same path. But the journey was dangerous. The underworld was not empty. It contained gates and guardians. The deceased needed knowledge. They needed to know the names of the guardians. They needed to know the correct words. They needed to know how to identify themselves. This is why some funerary texts contain lists of names. To modern readers, these sections can seem strange. Why would knowing a name matter so much? Because in ancient Egyptian thought, knowing the true name of something could give you power over it. If you knew the name of a gatekeeper, you could identify him. If you knew the correct formula, you could pass. If you failed, the journey could end. The afterlife was almost like a vast maze, and the inscriptions were the map. But there was another danger. For the dead to survive, their body and identity had to remain connected. This is why mummification was so important. The body was dried with natron. It was treated with oils and resins. It was wrapped in linen. Amulets were placed among the layers. The face could be carefully preserved. The body was placed inside a coffin, and the coffin itself could contain protective texts. It was an extraordinary combination of medicine, ritual, engineering, and religion. The Egyptians were trying to create a bridge between physical preservation and spiritual survival. And sometimes they succeeded far better than anyone could have expected. Some bodies survived for thousands of years. Some inscriptions remained readable. Some pigments remained visible. Some names remained recognizable. The tomb of the ancient doctor near Saqqara is a perfect example. His physical remains were missing, but his identity survived through writing. The man disappeared. His words did not. That may be one of the most powerful discoveries archaeologists can make. Because when the body is gone, the inscription becomes the body of evidence. It tells us who the person was, what they did, what they believed, and sometimes what they feared. Yet there is one question that still haunts researchers. How much of the ancient message are we actually able to understand? Hieroglyphs were deciphered in the modern era through painstaking work, most famously after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone. But even when individual signs can be translated, meaning is not always simple. A symbol can have multiple functions. A word can carry religious associations. A phrase can depend on its historical period. And a damaged inscription can leave entire sentences uncertain. In some cases, archaeologists must compare several versions of the same text. They examine grammar. They study the placement of symbols. They compare names and titles. They look at similar inscriptions from other tombs. Piece by piece, the meaning emerges. It is less like reading a modern book, and more like solving a 3,000-year-old puzzle. And sometimes, the missing pieces are exactly what make the mystery more terrifying. A broken sentence, a damaged name, a missing section, a symbol that nobody can confidently interpret, a chamber whose original purpose is unknown. These gaps leave room for questions. What was written here? Why was it erased? Who damaged it? Was the destruction intentional? Was something removed from the tomb? Or was the missing information simply lost to time? We may never know. But every new discovery adds another fragment, another word, another name, another piece of a civilization that once believed it could defeat oblivion. And perhaps that is the real message hidden inside the hieroglyphs. The Egyptians knew they would die. They knew their bodies would eventually decay. They knew tombs could be robbed. They knew monuments could collapse. They knew names could be forgotten. So they carved their words into stone. They painted them onto walls. They placed them beside their dead. They repeated them across generations. They were trying to make one promise: remember us. And more than 3,000 years later, we are still listening. But there is another side to the Egyptian story that becomes even more unsettling when you stop looking at the tombs as places of death and start seeing them as machines built for eternity. Every object had a purpose. Every symbol had meaning. Every chamber was part of a larger ritual. And somewhere inside that system was a question the Egyptians spent thousands of years trying to answer. What happens to a human being after the last breath? Their answer was not simple. They did not imagine the afterlife as one single place waiting beyond death. It was a complicated world filled with gods, gates, rivers, darkness, judgment, danger, and transformation. And the dead had to navigate it. This is why ancient Egyptian tombs can feel less like graves and more like enormous instruction manuals. The walls were covered with information. The coffins carried protective formulas. The body was surrounded by amulets. Food and drink were left behind. Clothing and jewelry were placed beside the deceased. Sometimes weapons were included. Sometimes furniture. Sometimes boats. Sometimes even games. The message was clear. The dead were not supposed to disappear. They were supposed to continue. But continuing required preparation. And one of the most important preparations was food. The Egyptians believed the dead still needed nourishment. Of course, the physical body could no longer eat in the normal way, but offerings could sustain the deceased spiritually. This is why tombs could contain enormous quantities of food and drink. In Tutankhamun's burial, archaeologists found containers associated with food and beverages. The tomb had been stocked as though the young king were preparing for a long journey. And from the ancient Egyptian perspective, that is exactly what it was. A journey. Not a few hours, not a few days, but an eternity. The same idea explains why the Egyptians created images of food on tomb walls. If the physical offerings disappeared, perhaps the painted offerings could continue to provide nourishment magically. A painted loaf could become food. A painted jar could become drink. a painted servant could continue performing work. This was not simply decoration. It was an attempt to make images function. The tomb became a kind of eternal household, and the deceased became its permanent resident. But there was a problem. An eternal household needs protection, and that is where Egyptian magic enters the story. The word magic can make ancient Egyptian practices sound primitive, but the Egyptians did not necessarily separate magic, religion, and medicine in the way modern people do. A doctor could use herbs. He could clean a wound. He could perform a practical medical procedure. And at the same time, he could recite a spell. The ancient physician Teti Neb Fu is a perfect example. His title suggests that he possessed specialized medical knowledge. He was associated with medicinal plants. He was connected with the treatment of dangerous stings. He was also identified as a chief dentist. This combination tells us something important. Ancient Egyptian medicine was not simply superstition. They observed symptoms. They developed treatments. They used plants, oils, resins, bandages, splints, and surgical tools. But they also believed supernatural forces could influence illness. So physical treatment and ritual protection could exist side by side. To them, there was no contradiction. A plant could heal the body. A spell could protect the spirit. A physician could work with both. This worldview also explains the mysterious scorpion deity associated with Teti Neb Fu. The Egyptians understood venom as a deadly threat. A scorpion sting could kill. So a deity associated with scorpions could represent both danger and protection. The same creature that caused suffering could become a symbol of defense against it. This is a recurring pattern in ancient Egyptian religion. Danger and protection were often connected. The gods could be terrifying, but they could also protect. The underworld was dangerous, but it was also the path to resurrection. Death was frightening, but it could lead to eternal life. Even darkness had a purpose. The sun disappeared into darkness every evening, then returned. This cycle became one of the foundations of Egyptian religious thought. And perhaps it explains why the Egyptians were so obsessed with repetition. The same rituals, the same formulas, the same symbols, the same names, again and again, because repetition created continuity, and continuity created stability. That concept was closely connected with Ma'at. Ma'at represented truth, order, balance, and cosmic stability. The universe itself was believed to depend on maintaining this order. The pharaoh had a major responsibility in preserving it. That is why Egyptian kings were not simply political rulers. They were connected with the gods. Their role was partly religious. They were expected to maintain harmony between the human world and the divine world. And when a pharaoh died, his transformation into an eternal ruler became part of that same cosmic order. This helps explain why royal tombs became so elaborate. A pharaoh was not being buried like an ordinary person. The burial was part of a larger transition. The king was being transformed. The tomb was the stage. The rituals were the process. The inscriptions were the instructions. And the mummy was the physical anchor. But the Egyptians eventually discovered that no tomb was truly safe. The greatest royal burials were attacked. Treasures disappeared. Mummies were damaged. And sometimes the priests themselves had to move royal remains. This happened repeatedly. One of the most famous examples is the cache at Deir el-Bahari. Royal mummies, including powerful rulers such as Ramses II, were eventually hidden together in a secret location. The priests were trying to protect them from tomb robbers. For a time, it worked. The kings were hidden. The tombs were forgotten. Then, more than 3,000 years later, archaeologists found them. The discovery was extraordinary. Imagine entering a hidden chamber and realizing that the bodies of some of Egypt's greatest rulers were lying together in the darkness. Men who once commanded armies, men who built monuments, men whose names had once terrified enemies, reduced to silent bodies wrapped in linen. and yet their identities had survived. Their names were still there. Their titles were still there. Their stories were still there. This is where archaeology becomes almost philosophical. What exactly survives a human being? The body? The name? The memory? The monument? The words? Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none. A doctor could use herbs. He could clean a wound. He could perform a practical medical procedure. And at the same time, he could recite a spell. The ancient physician Teti Neb Fu is a perfect example. His titles suggest that he possessed specialized medical knowledge. He was associated with medicinal plants. He was connected with the treatment of dangerous stings. He was also identified as a chief dentist. This combination tells us something important. Ancient Egyptian medicine was not simply superstition. They observed symptoms. They developed treatments. They used plants, oils, resins, bandages, splints, and surgical tools. But they also believed supernatural forces could influence illness. So physical treatment and ritual protection could exist side by side. To them, there was no contradiction. A plant could heal the body. A spell could protect the spirit. A physician could work with both. This worldview also explains the mysterious scorpion deity associated with Teti Neb Fu. The Egyptians understood venom as a deadly threat. A scorpion sting could kill. So a deity associated with scorpions could represent both danger and protection. The same creature that caused suffering could become a symbol of defense against it. This is a recurring pattern in ancient Egyptian religion. Danger and protection were often connected. The gods could be terrifying, but they could also protect. The underworld was dangerous, but it was also the path to resurrection. Death was frightening, but it could lead to eternal life. Even darkness had a purpose. The sun disappeared into darkness every evening, then returned. This cycle became one of the foundations of Egyptian religious thought. And perhaps it explains why the Egyptians were so obsessed with repetition. The same rituals, the same formulas, the same symbols, the same names, again and again. Because repetition created continuity, and continuity created stability. That concept was closely connected with Ma'at. Ma'at represented truth, order, balance, and cosmic stability. The universe itself was believed to depend on maintaining this order. The pharaoh had a major responsibility in preserving it. That is why Egyptian kings were not simply political rulers. They were connected with the gods. Their role was partly religious. They were expected to maintain harmony between the human world and the divine world. And when a pharaoh died, his transformation into an eternal ruler became part of that same cosmic order. This helps explain why royal tombs became so elaborate. A pharaoh was not being buried like an ordinary person. The burial was part of a larger transition. The king was being transformed. The tomb was the stage. The rituals were the process. The inscriptions were the instructions. And the mummy was the physical anchor. But the Egyptians eventually discovered that no tomb was truly safe. The greatest royal burials were attacked. Treasures disappeared. Mummies were damaged. And sometimes the priests themselves had to move royal remains. This happened repeatedly. One of the most famous examples is the cache at Deir el-Bahari. Royal mummies, including powerful rulers such as Ramses II, were eventually hidden together in a secret location. The priests were trying to protect them from tomb robbers. For a time it worked. The kings were hidden. The tombs were forgotten. Then, more than 3,000 years later, archaeologists found them. The discovery was extraordinary. Imagine entering a hidden chamber and realizing that the bodies of some of Egypt's greatest rulers were lying together in the darkness. Men who once commanded armies, men who built monuments, men whose names had once terrified enemies, reduced to silent bodies wrapped in linen. And yet, their identities had survived. Their names were still there. Their titles were still there. Their stories were still there. This is where archaeology becomes almost philosophical. What exactly survives a human being? The body? The name? The memory? The monument? The words? Perhaps all of them. Perhaps none. The Egyptians believed they could preserve themselves through all these things at once. But history shows that preservation is fragile. A tomb can flood. A coffin can crack. A mummy can decay. An inscription can be damaged. A name can be erased. A civilization can disappear. And yet sometimes a tiny fragment survives. A single jar. A piece of linen. A scarab. A tooth. A wooden object. A few painted symbols. And that tiny fragment can completely change what historians thought they knew. This is why archaeologists are so careful today. Modern researchers have learned from the mistakes of the past. Earlier explorers sometimes opened mummies, removed wrappings, cut through bodies, and separated objects without the technology available today. Some discoveries were damaged permanently. Tutankhamun's mummy is one of the clearest examples. The researchers were trying to understand the king, but the methods available to them were crude compared with modern imaging. Today, a CT scan can reveal the interior of a mummy without unwrapping it. A digital model can allow researchers to examine the skeleton. Three-dimensional reconstruction can show details invisible from the outside. Chemical analysis can reveal what substances were used during embalming. DNA can sometimes reveal family relationships. And even tiny samples can contain information about diet, disease, migration, and ancestry. The mummy becomes a scientific archive. But technology does something else. It changes the meaning of the ancient inscriptions. Suppose a text describes a person as a powerful warrior. A scan of that person's skeleton might reveal severe injuries. Suppose a tomb describes someone as healthy and blessed by the gods. Their teeth might tell a different story. Suppose a monument praises a ruler's strength. Their bones may reveal years of physical stress. The written record and the biological record can be compared. Sometimes they agree. Sometimes they do not. And when they disagree, that is where the mystery becomes interesting. Because the ancient Egyptians controlled how they wanted to be remembered. A royal inscription could praise a king as unstoppable. A monument could show him defeating enemies. A tomb could portray him as eternally youthful. But his mummy cannot completely hide the evidence of aging. His teeth cannot pretend. His bones cannot flatter him. His injuries remain. His diseases remain. His physical limitations remain. Thousands of years after the monuments were carved, the body can still tell another story. This is one reason the discovery of mummies has changed archaeology. They turned history into something physical. Instead of reading only about ancient people, scientists can examine them. They can study their bodies, their diets, their illnesses, their injuries, their environment, their final moments, and sometimes even the contents of their stomachs. Otzi the Iceman is perhaps the most famous example outside Egypt. His frozen body preserved evidence of his final days. Scientists could reconstruct aspects of his diet. They could identify medical conditions. They could study his tools. They could even investigate wounds that may have been connected to the circumstances of his death. A person who disappeared thousands of years ago suddenly became a source of information. And the same principle applies to Egyptian mummies. Every mummy contains a story. The problem is that the story is written in a language we cannot always read. Sometimes it is written in bone, sometimes in teeth, sometimes in chemical traces, sometimes in DNA, sometimes in the wrapping, and sometimes it is written on the walls. The hieroglyphs provide the voice. The mummy provides the body. The tomb provides the setting. Together, they create something extraordinary, a conversation across thousands of years. But there are still messages we cannot fully understand, symbols whose meanings remain uncertain, damaged inscriptions, missing sections, burials whose identities are unknown, tombs whose original contents vanished long ago. And perhaps somewhere beneath Egypt, another chamber is still waiting, another wall, another name, another message, another warning, because Egypt's greatest mystery may not be what archaeologists have already discovered. It may be what is still hidden. And if the ancient Egyptians were right about one thing, the dead have been waiting a very long time to speak. The deeper we look into ancient Egypt, the more one disturbing possibility begins to emerge. Perhaps the most important messages were never meant to be understood by the living. They were written for people who were already dead. And yet, thousands of years later, we are standing in their tombs, reading their words, examining their bodies, and trying to reconstruct the final journey they believed awaited them. But there is something even stranger. Sometimes the evidence left behind does not simply tell us what the Egyptians believed. It reveals what they were afraid of. Fear is everywhere in ancient Egyptian funerary culture. Fear of darkness, fear of disease, fear of venom, fear of forgetting, fear of tomb robbers, fear of the body being destroyed, and above all, fear of failing to reach the afterlife. This fear may explain why Egyptian tombs were filled with protective objects. Amulets were placed between layers of linen. Scarab symbols were positioned over the heart. Protective images were painted on coffins. Spells were written across walls. Names of gods were repeated. The deceased was surrounded by a supernatural defense system. But perhaps the strangest form of protection was the preservation of the face. Why spend so much effort making sure the dead still looked like themselves? Because identity mattered. The ancient Egyptians believed the person who entered the afterlife needed to remain recognizable. The face was part of that identity. The name was part of that identity. The body was part of that identity. The tomb was part of that identity. Destroy one piece and the entire system could be threatened. This is why Egyptian embalmers were so careful. The body was dried with natron. The skin was treated. The cavities could be filled. The body was wrapped in layers of linen. Amulets were inserted between the wrappings. Resins were applied. The face could be covered with a mask or carefully painted image. Everything was designed to preserve the deceased. But the process was not only technical, it was ritualistic. A ceremony known as the opening of the mouth was performed on the deceased. The ritual was intended to restore the senses, the mouth, the eyes, the ears, the nose. The deceased could symbolically breathe, speak, see, hear, and eat again. Think about what that means. The Egyptians were not simply preparing a corpse. They were preparing a person to live again. Not physically in the way we understand resurrection today, but spiritually. The body had become a vessel. The tomb had become a home. The afterlife had become another existence. And the rituals were designed to make the transition possible. This belief helps explain something that can seem strange to modern visitors. Many Egyptian tomb paintings show the deceased performing ordinary activities. They hunt, they fish, they eat, they drink, they sit with family, they supervise workers, they enjoy music, they walk through gardens. Why? Because the Egyptians wanted these experiences to continue. The afterlife was not supposed to be an empty paradise. It was supposed to contain the things that made life worth living: food, family, comfort, status, beauty, order. But there was one enormous difference. In the afterlife, these things had to be eternal, and that required magic. The Egyptians believed images could become functional through ritual. A painted loaf could provide nourishment. A painted servant could perform labor. A painted boat could provide transportation. A painted garden could become a real place in the spiritual world. The walls of a tomb were therefore not simply showing the future. They were helping create it. This may sound strange to us, but within the Egyptian worldview it made perfect sense. Words had power. Images had power. Names had power. And rituals activated that power. The ancient Egyptians were essentially building an eternal environment for the deceased. But then comes the question that has fascinated historians for centuries. What exactly did they expect to find on the other side? The answer depends on the period. During the Old Kingdom, royal funerary texts emphasized the king's transformation and ascent into the heavens. The deceased ruler could become associated with the stars. He could join the gods. He could become part of the cosmic order. Later traditions placed greater emphasis on Osiris and the underworld. The dead became connected with the god of resurrection. The journey became more elaborate. The dangers increased. The number of spells expanded. And eventually, collections of funerary texts became available to people beyond the royal family. This is important. At first, many of these elaborate funerary traditions were strongly associated with kings. But over time, wealthy individuals could acquire their own funerary texts. The desire for eternal life was no longer restricted to the pharaoh. Ordinary people wanted it too. Of course, wealth mattered. A poor Egyptian could not commission the same kind of burial as a pharaoh, but the basic hope was shared. To survive, to be remembered, to reach the afterlife. This may be one of the reasons Egyptian civilization maintained such a strong funerary tradition for so long. The belief was deeply personal. Everyone dies. Everyone loses someone. And everyone eventually faces the same unknown. The Egyptians simply developed an elaborate system for confronting it. Their answer was preparation. Prepare the body. Prepare the tomb. Prepare the offerings. Prepare the spells. Prepare the name. Prepare for judgment. And prepare for the journey. But then archaeology discovered something that made this entire system even more fascinating. Some people were not buried in elaborate tombs at all. Some were buried simply. Some bodies were naturally preserved. Some graves contained only a few objects. Others were enormous. This difference tells us that Egyptian society was deeply hierarchical. A pharaoh could command thousands of workers to construct a monument that would dominate the landscape for generations. A wealthy official could afford an elaborately decorated tomb. A skilled physician could receive a prestigious burial. But most people could not. And yet even the simplest burial could contain evidence of belief. A small amulet, a piece of pottery, a body positioned carefully, a simple offering, a name. These tiny details allow archaeologists to reconstruct the beliefs of people whose names never appeared on giant monuments. That is one reason the tomb of Teti Neb-Fu is so fascinating. He was clearly important. His titles were unusual. His knowledge was specialized. His tomb contained elaborate paintings and inscriptions. But the physical remains of the man were gone. His body had disappeared. His treasures had disappeared. What remained was the evidence. The words, the images, the symbols, and those fragments were enough to reconstruct his identity. He becomes an example of something the Egyptians themselves understood very well. A person can disappear physically, but still survive through memory. That idea becomes even more powerful when we examine the destruction of royal monuments. Some pharaohs deliberately erased the names of their predecessors. Political enemies could be transformed into historical ghosts. A ruler could be removed from official records. A statue could be smashed. A face could be destroyed. A name could be chiseled away. Yet, archaeology can sometimes reverse that destruction. Fragments are found. Names are reconstructed. Missing pieces are compared with other inscriptions. The erased king returns. The forgotten queen returns. The forgotten doctor returns. History becomes an act of resurrection. Not spiritual resurrection, historical resurrection. And perhaps this is why deciphering hieroglyphs is so important. Before scholars could read Egyptian writing, countless names and stories were locked behind symbols. A wall could contain hundreds of words, but to an outsider, they were silent. Then came the breakthrough. The Rosetta Stone provided scholars with versions of the same decree written in different scripts, including Greek and Egyptian forms. By comparing them, scholars eventually began unlocking the hieroglyphic system. The breakthrough changed everything. Suddenly, monuments could speak. Tombs could speak. Statues could speak. Coffins could speak. And the ancient Egyptians began telling their own stories. But deciphering a language is not the same as understanding an entire civilization. Words can be translated. Ideas are harder. A phrase may have religious meaning that has no perfect modern equivalent. A symbol can mean one thing in one period and something different in another. A spell can combine religion, mythology, ritual, and symbolism. And sometimes we simply do not know. This is where the mystery survives. Even after more than a century of archaeology, there are still inscriptions that are damaged, incomplete, or disputed. There are tombs whose owners remain unidentified. There are royal burials whose original locations are uncertain. There are objects whose exact purpose is debated. And there are entire sections of ancient Egyptian life that left almost no written record. The danger is assuming that because we can read the symbols, we understand the people. We don't. We are looking through a window, and the window is broken. Some pieces are clear. Others are missing. Some have been distorted by time. But every discovery adds another fragment. And sometimes, one fragment changes the entire picture. Consider ancient Egyptian medicine. For decades, people imagined Egyptian physicians as primitive healers relying mostly on magic. Then, archaeological evidence and medical texts revealed something much more sophisticated. They had specialists. They treated wounds. They used splints. They performed surgical procedures. They developed herbal treatments. They treated dental problems. They used various forms of medication. And they understood that different illnesses required different approaches. Their knowledge was imperfect. They misunderstood many aspects of anatomy. But their observations were often surprisingly practical. The ancient doctor from Saqqara embodies that contradiction. He was both healer and ritual specialist, scientist and religious practitioner, doctor and magician. To modern eyes, those categories seem incompatible. To him, they were probably part of the same profession. And perhaps that is the key to understanding ancient Egypt. We keep trying to divide their world into categories: science, religion, medicine, magic, politics, death, life. But the Egyptians did not necessarily see these things as separate. Everything was connected. The universe had order. The gods maintained that order. The pharaoh represented it. Doctors protected the body. Priests protected the spirit. Scribes preserved knowledge. Embalmers preserved the dead. And the tomb connected them all. The result was one of the most extraordinary civilizations in human history. A civilization that spent thousands of years trying to answer a question that still has no definitive answer. What happens after death? The Egyptians believed they knew. They wrote down the instructions. They carved the names. They prepared the bodies. They sealed the tombs. And then they waited for thousands of years until we came searching. And now, every time an archaeologist brushes dust from an ancient inscription, another piece of their answer returns. But perhaps the most terrifying possibility is this. Maybe the inscriptions are not only telling us what the Egyptians believed would happen after death. Maybe they are telling us what they feared could happen if the rituals failed. For thousands of years, the sands of Egypt have hidden more than tombs. They have hidden warnings, messages written by people who believed death was not the end, but a dangerous passage into another world. And among the countless inscriptions left behind, some seem strangely specific. They don't simply describe gods. They don't merely praise kings. They give instructions, words to speak, names to remember, doors to pass through, creatures to avoid, and powers to call upon. Imagine standing alone inside a tomb more than 3,000 years old. The air is dry. The walls are covered in faded colors. There is no sound except your own breathing. Then your flashlight moves across the stone, and a human figure appears. Beside it are rows of symbols. At first, they look like decoration. Birds, eyes, hands, reeds, snakes, sun discs. But these are not random pictures. They are words. And once you understand what they say, the atmosphere changes completely. Because the wall is no longer silent. It is speaking. And sometimes, it is speaking directly to the dead. Ancient Egyptian funerary texts were filled with instructions for navigating the afterlife. The deceased had to know names, the names of gates, the names of divine beings, the names of guardians. The correct words could open a passage. The wrong words could leave the traveler trapped. This is one of the most fascinating aspects of Egyptian religion. Knowledge itself could be a form of protection. A person who knew the right spell possessed something more valuable than gold. They possessed information. And in the ancient Egyptian imagination, information could determine whether you survived the journey beyond death. This may explain why scribes were so important. They were not simply people who could write. They were guardians of knowledge. Writing was a specialized skill. The ability to record a name, a prayer, a legal document, or a funerary formula gave a person access to a world that most people could not enter. The written word had authority. And in a tomb, that authority became almost supernatural. A sentence carved into stone could remain there for generations. A name written thousands of times could preserve someone's identity long after their body had disappeared. This was not just record-keeping. It was survival. That belief becomes especially powerful when we consider the importance of the name. To the Egyptians, a person's name was not simply a label. It was part of their existence. If your name survived, a part of you survived. If your name was forgotten, something essential had been lost. This is why kings carved their names everywhere. On temples, on statues, on obelisks, inside tombs, across monuments that were designed to outlive generations. And this is also why political enemies sometimes tried to erase names. To destroy a person's name was more than an insult. It was an attack on their existence. The ancient Egyptians understood something deeply human. We fear being forgotten. Thousands of years later, we still do. We build monuments. We publish books. We create photographs. We leave messages. We want some trace of ourselves to remain. The Egyptians simply took that desire to an extraordinary level. Their tombs became monuments to memory. But there was another problem. What if someone destroyed the body? What if the tomb was robbed? What if the name was erased? What if the offerings stopped? The Egyptians tried to prepare for all of these possibilities. This is why their funerary system became so elaborate. The tomb could contain replacement offerings. The walls could contain images of food. Servant figures could perform symbolic labor. Protective amulets could defend the body. Spells could compensate for missing knowledge. The system was designed with redundancy. If one protection failed, another might still work. It was almost like building a backup system for eternity. And perhaps that is why the discovery of damaged tombs can be so disturbing. A tomb may still contain beautiful paintings, but the body is gone. The offerings are missing. The coffin has been destroyed. The name has been damaged. Sometimes only fragments remain. Yet those fragments can still tell us something. They can reveal social status, occupation, family relationships, religious beliefs, medical conditions, political connections, even personal fears. The dead continue speaking through the objects they left behind. And this is where modern technology has changed archaeology forever. For centuries, researchers had to physically open mummies. They cut through linen. They removed wrappings. Sometimes they damaged fragile remains. In some cases, the damage was irreversible. The story of Tutankhamun is a powerful example. When his mummy was examined in the 1920s, researchers faced an enormous problem. The body had become firmly attached to the coffin by hardened resins. Removing it required aggressive intervention. Parts of the mummy were separated. The body was examined. Bones and teeth were studied. But the process also caused damage. Today, researchers approach ancient remains differently. Instead of unwrapping a mummy, they can scan it. Thousands of X-ray images can be combined into a three-dimensional reconstruction. Inside the body, researchers can see bones, teeth, foreign objects, amulets, evidence of disease, sometimes even details of the embalming process. The mummy stays wrapped. The coffin stays intact. And the archaeologist gets a virtual window into the past. This technology is changing what we can learn from ancient bodies. A mummy that once seemed completely mysterious can suddenly reveal its age, its injuries, its health, its diet, sometimes even the circumstances surrounding its death. But technology has another advantage. It can reveal what cannot be seen from the outside. Take the ancient Egyptian doctor buried near Saqqara. His body was missing, but the tomb itself survived. The paintings survived. The inscriptions survived. And those inscriptions revealed an extraordinary career. He was associated with medicinal plants. He was connected to the treatment of dangerous bites and stings. He was associated with dentistry. These details turn a seemingly empty tomb into a historical document. The missing body does not mean the man disappeared completely. His knowledge survived. His titles survived. His reputation survived. And now, thousands of years later, we know his name. That is an incredible form of survival. But the mystery becomes darker when we look at the religious context surrounding medical treatment. The ancient Egyptians believed illness could have multiple causes. A physical problem could require medicine. But supernatural forces could also be involved. A physician might treat a wound while reciting a spell. A remedy could contain practical ingredients while being accompanied by religious words. To us, this may look like a contradiction. To them, it was perfectly logical. The physical and spiritual worlds were connected. A scorpion sting was a medical emergency. But the scorpion also had divine associations. The goddess Serket was associated with protection against venomous creatures. A specialist who served her could therefore occupy a unique position. He wasn't simply treating a wound. He was confronting something that could be both biological and supernatural. That tells us something important about ancient Egyptian medicine. They were not separating science from religion in the way we do. They were trying to solve problems using every form of knowledge available to them. Observation, experience, plants, minerals, surgery, ritual, prayer, and sometimes magic. Whether the magical elements actually worked is another question. But the medical treatments themselves sometimes had practical value. Ancient Egyptian medical texts contain recipes for wounds, infections, burns, intestinal problems, and other conditions. Some ingredients would have had genuine medicinal properties. Others probably did very little, and some may have been harmful. But the broader point is remarkable. They were experimenting. They were observing. They were recording. They were passing knowledge from one generation to another. That is how medicine develops. Slowly, through trial and error, through successes and failures, and sometimes through discoveries that only become understandable thousands of years later. Ancient Egypt was not a modern medical civilization, but it was not a world of pure superstition either. It existed somewhere between observation and belief, between practical knowledge and religion, between the physical world and the supernatural. And that strange combination appears everywhere in Egyptian culture. It is visible in the tombs. It is visible in the pyramids. It is visible in their art, and perhaps nowhere is it more obvious than in their obsession with death. The Egyptians spent enormous resources preparing for something no living person could prove existed. They built enormous tombs. They created complex rituals. They preserved bodies. They filled chambers with food and objects. They wrote instructions on walls. They decorated coffins. They created entire books about the journey into the afterlife. Why? Because uncertainty was terrifying. And perhaps that is what makes their civilization feel strangely familiar. We may not believe exactly what they believed. We may not build pyramids. We may not place food beside our dead. We may not write spells on coffins, but we still search for answers. We still wonder what happens after death. We still preserve photographs of people we have lost. We still visit graves. We still tell stories about those who came before us. The methods have changed. The question has not. And buried beneath the sands of Egypt are thousands of attempts to answer it. Some are beautiful. Some are mysterious. Some are disturbing. And some remain completely undeciphered. That is why the discovery of a new inscription can be so powerful. One sentence can change a timeline. One name can identify a forgotten person. One symbol can reveal a previously unknown ritual. One damaged wall can force historians to rethink an entire period. The ancient Egyptians believed words had power. Perhaps they were right in a way they never imagined. Their words survived. Their voices survived. Their fears survived. And now, we are listening. But there is still one final question. If these ancient texts were created to guide the dead through a dangerous world beyond the grave, why did their writers feel the need to describe the dangers in such detail? What did they believe was waiting beyond the final gate? And if the hieroglyphs truly contain instructions for surviving that journey, then perhaps the most terrifying message has not been translated yet. For more than 3,000 years, the Egyptians wrote about the journey after death. They described gates guarded by strange beings. They named rivers that had to be crossed. They warned of fire, darkness, serpents, knives, and judgment. And they believed the dead could fail. That single idea changes the way we should look at Egyptian tombs. These were not simply monuments built to celebrate a person's life. They were survival manuals. The walls were instructions. The paintings were maps. The amulets were protection. The mummy was the vessel. And the spells were the key. But if the ancient Egyptians were so certain that the dead needed protection, what exactly were they protecting them from? To understand that, we have to enter the world of the Egyptian underworld. The Egyptians called it the Duat. It was not simply a place beneath the ground. It was a mysterious realm connected to the night journey of the sun. Every evening, the sun disappeared beyond the western horizon. To the Egyptians, this was not just the end of daylight. The sun god Ra was believed to travel through the underworld during the night. There, he encountered dangers, enemies, gods, and supernatural forces. Then, at dawn, he emerged again. The cycle repeated. Every day, every night. Death and rebirth. Darkness and light. Destruction and renewal. The dead were expected to follow a similar journey. And this is where the symbolism becomes extraordinary. The Egyptians were not simply imagining death as darkness. They were imagining death as a transition, a dangerous transition, a journey through a hidden world. And the deceased needed knowledge to survive it. One of the most important sources of this knowledge was what we now call the Book of the Dead. Despite its modern name, it was not really a single book. It was a collection of funerary spells and formulas that could be arranged in different ways. Different people received different combinations. Some texts were written on papyrus. Others appeared on coffins. Some were carved directly into tomb walls. The purpose was practical within the Egyptian belief system. Help the deceased navigate the afterlife. Protect them from danger. Give them the correct words. And allow them to reach the next stage. One famous section describes the weighing of the heart. This scene became one of the most recognizable images in Egyptian funerary art. The deceased stands before Osiris. Nearby, Anubis oversees a balance. On one side is the heart. On the other is the feather associated with Ma'at. Ma'at represented truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. The heart had to be sufficiently pure. If it was judged worthy, the deceased could continue. But if it failed, something terrible awaited. A creature known as Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, a monster designed to represent destruction. Ammit did not simply kill the deceased, she consumed the heart. And once the heart was destroyed, the individual could no longer continue into the blessed afterlife. This is important because it reveals something deeply human about Egyptian religion. The afterlife was not guaranteed. A person could prepare. They could perform rituals. They could carry amulets. They could memorize spells. But there was still a moral dimension. How you lived mattered. The heart carried the evidence. Your actions followed you. Your character followed you. Your life followed you into death. This idea makes the ancient Egyptian belief system far more sophisticated than the simple image of people worshiping gods and building pyramids. They were also thinking about morality, order, responsibility, justice, and consequences. Ma'at was not merely a religious concept. It represented the order of the universe itself. The sun rose, the Nile flooded, the seasons changed, kings ruled, society functioned, the universe remained balanced. Chaos was always waiting to break that balance, and the individual had a role in maintaining it. The pharaoh was especially important because the king was believed to maintain order between humans and the gods. That is why royal death was such a serious matter. If the king failed to transition properly into the afterlife, the consequences could extend beyond the individual. The stability of the kingdom was connected to the stability of the cosmos. This may help explain the extraordinary effort invested in royal burials. The pyramid was not simply a gigantic tomb. It was part of a much larger religious system. The architecture, rituals, texts, orientation, and offerings all served a purpose. Everything had meaning. The direction of the pyramid mattered. The relationship with the sun mattered. The connection to the stars mattered. The rituals mattered. The words mattered. And perhaps most importantly, the king's identity had to survive. This is why names appear again and again in Egyptian monuments. A name was a form of immortality. As long as someone spoke it, read it, or remembered it, the person continued to exist in some sense. That is why the destruction of a royal name could be so powerful. When later rulers erased names from monuments, they were not merely changing history. They were attempting to control memory. And history is full of rulers who tried. One of the most dramatic examples involves Akhenaten. He radically changed Egyptian religion by elevating the Aten, the solar disk, above the traditional pantheon. Temples were built. Traditional gods were pushed aside. The capital was moved. Art changed. Royal imagery changed. The old religious order was challenged. But after Akhenaten's death, his successors reversed much of his religious revolution. His name was attacked. His monuments were dismantled. His memory was suppressed. For centuries, Akhenaten became a shadow in Egyptian history. Then archaeology brought him back. Fragments were discovered. Inscriptions were reconstructed. His abandoned city was excavated. And suddenly, the forgotten king returned. This is one of the strange powers of archaeology. It can undo ancient attempts at forgetting. A ruler can destroy a monument, but they cannot always destroy every fragment. A broken statue still carries clues. A damaged inscription still contains letters. A buried foundation still reveals a building. A forgotten tomb can still contain a name. And sometimes, one tiny object is enough to rewrite history. That is exactly what makes archaeology so unpredictable. The most important discovery does not always look impressive. It may be a small piece of pottery, a fragment of papyrus, a seal, a tooth, a scarab, a few lines of hieroglyphs, a broken coffin, or a single sentence hidden behind plaster. Modern archaeologists increasingly understand that context is everything. Where an object was found matters. What was around it matters. What layer it came from matters. Who was buried nearby matters. Even the position of an artifact can reveal information. Take a simple amulet. By itself, it might look like a piece of jewelry. But if it is found inside a mummy's wrappings, positioned near a particular organ, it becomes evidence of a ritual. If the amulet has a specific symbol, it may reveal which protection was intended. If several amulets appear in a particular arrangement, researchers can compare them with funerary texts. Slowly, the burial becomes a message. And sometimes the message is surprisingly personal. Ancient Egyptians did not always bury people with generic objects. They could include things connected to their profession, their social position, their family, their hobbies, their beliefs. A scribe might be represented with writing equipment. A military official might have weapons. A wealthy woman might be buried with jewelry. A priest might have religious objects. And a doctor might have titles revealing specialized medical knowledge. This is why the tomb of Teti Neb Fu is so significant. The walls tell us what mattered about him. Not simply that he lived, but what he knew, what he did, and what role he played in society. His titles connect medicine, plants, dentistry, and supernatural protection. That combination gives us a glimpse into the Egyptian understanding of healing. It was not one discipline. It was an entire world of knowledge. The doctor needed to understand the body, but he also needed to understand plants, diseases, injuries, rituals, and perhaps most importantly, the beliefs of his patients. Imagine being a physician in ancient Egypt. Someone arrives after being bitten by a venomous creature. You examine the wound. You apply a treatment. You prepare an herbal remedy. and you recite a protective formula. From a modern perspective, those actions belong to completely different categories. For the Egyptian healer, they could all be part of the same treatment. This worldview is difficult for us to fully understand, but it is exactly why their medical texts are so fascinating. They contain practical observations mixed with magical formulas. Sometimes the practical part is surprisingly accurate. Sometimes the ritual dominates. And sometimes we cannot tell where one ends and the other begins. But perhaps that uncertainty is itself part of the story. Ancient people were not trying to become modern scientists. They were trying to survive. They observed what worked. They remembered what failed. They passed information forward. And over generations, that accumulated knowledge became a tradition. Some of it survived. Some disappeared. Some was buried. And some was written into stone. The hieroglyphs we see today are therefore more than ancient writing. They are fragments of a knowledge system, a system that included medicine, astronomy, mathematics, religion, architecture, agriculture, politics, and death. The strange thing is that the Egyptians left behind enormous amounts of evidence. Yet we still understand only part of it. Thousands of tombs remain unexplored. Some are buried beneath modern settlements. Some were robbed in antiquity. Others collapsed. Some may have never been discovered. And there may still be royal burials waiting somewhere beneath the desert. That possibility is one reason Egypt remains one of the greatest archaeological frontiers on Earth. Every new excavation can reveal another piece of the puzzle. And every piece can create another question. That is what happened with the discovery of Thutmose II's tomb. For years, archaeologists knew the pharaoh's mummy existed, but the original tomb had remained unidentified. Then a seemingly ordinary excavation produced evidence. An entrance, a corridor, fragments, alabaster vessels, the king's name. Suddenly, a forgotten burial became identifiable. But the tomb itself was empty. Not because thieves had necessarily taken everything, but because ancient flooding had forced the Egyptians to move the burial. The tomb had become unusable. The body was transferred. The contents were moved. And the original burial place became a forgotten chamber beneath the mountains. Thousands of years later, archaeologists returned. They found the empty tomb. But emptiness did not mean failure. The tomb itself was the message. Its architecture, its damage, its inscriptions, its connection to other royal burials. Everything helped reconstruct the story. And this is perhaps the greatest lesson archaeology teaches us. History does not survive only in perfect monuments. It survives in ruins, in mistakes, in damage, in missing pieces, in abandoned tombs, in erased names, in empty chambers. Even silence can contain information, because sometimes the most important question is not, what did they leave behind? It is, what happened to what is missing? Where did the mummy go? Why was the tomb abandoned? Who removed the objects? Why was the name erased? Why was one inscription placed here instead of somewhere else? Those questions lead deeper into the mystery. And somewhere beneath the layers of sand, stone, and time, there may still be an answer waiting. A message written thousands of years ago. A message intended for someone who would never see the modern world. A message about death, about judgment, about survival, and perhaps about something the ancient Egyptians feared more than death itself, being forgotten. There is something unsettling about ancient Egyptian tombs. The deeper you go, the more you realize that the Egyptians were not simply trying to preserve the dead. They were trying to control what happened after death. Every object had a purpose. Every symbol carried meaning. Every word could become a weapon against the unknown. And somewhere inside that elaborate system was one terrifying possibility. What if the dead could not find their way? What if the spells were forgotten? What if the wrong name was spoken? What if the heart failed the judgment? What if the body was destroyed? For the ancient Egyptians, these were not abstract questions. They were real dangers. That is why funerary knowledge became so important. And perhaps the most fascinating evidence of this knowledge comes from the texts written on coffins. The coffin texts appeared during the Middle Kingdom, centuries after the earliest pyramid inscriptions. Unlike some of the earlier royal texts, they were not restricted exclusively to kings. Private individuals could now carry protective formulas into the afterlife. The transformation is remarkable. The secrets of eternity were becoming available to more people. A person could be buried with instructions for navigating the underworld. They could have spells written directly onto the coffin surrounding their body. Imagine being sealed inside a wooden coffin, and the entire surface around you is covered with words designed to protect you. The coffin itself becomes a map, a barrier, a book, a shield. The dead person is surrounded by information, and much of that information concerns the dangers of the afterlife. There were gates, there were guardians, there were creatures, there were places where the deceased could become trapped. There were obstacles that required specific knowledge. The deceased had to identify beings correctly. They had to know names. They had to speak formulas. They had to demonstrate that they belonged among the blessed dead. This tells us something profound about Egyptian society. Knowledge was power, even after death. But the Egyptians were not only concerned with supernatural dangers, they were also worried about something much more physical: the destruction of the body. A body could decay. A tomb could collapse. A coffin could be damaged. A burial could be robbed. And once a body was destroyed, the entire afterlife system could theoretically be threatened. That is why mummification became so important. The Egyptians developed techniques that allowed them to preserve bodies for astonishing lengths of time. The process could take around 70 days. The internal organs were treated separately. The body was dried with natron. It was wrapped in linen. Resins were applied. Amulets were inserted. The final result was more than preservation. It was transformation. The ordinary human body became a sacred object. And the more important the person, the more elaborate the process could become. But mummification was never just about keeping the body intact. The Egyptians believed that different parts of a person continued to exist after death. The Ka, the Ba, the Ak, the name, the shadow, the body. These concepts are difficult to translate perfectly into modern language. They were not simply different pieces of a human being. They represented different aspects of identity and existence. The Ka was associated with life force. The Ba was often represented as a human-headed bird and connected with personality and movement. The Akh represented a transformed, effective spirit. The name preserved identity. The body provided a physical anchor. The system was complicated, but the goal was simple. The individual needed to continue existing. That explains why the Egyptians could be so terrified of destruction. If a tomb was damaged, it mattered. If the mummy was destroyed, it mattered. If offerings stopped, it mattered. If the name disappeared, it mattered. Death was not the only enemy. Forgetting was another. And perhaps the most dramatic example of this fear can be found in the treatment of royal enemies. When a king ordered a predecessor's name removed from a monument, the attack was symbolic. The ruler was attempting to erase the person's presence from the world. But sometimes the opposite happened. The destruction itself became evidence. Archaeologists can see where a name was deliberately removed. They can compare the damaged inscription with surviving copies. They can reconstruct the missing letters. And suddenly, The erased individual returns. This is exactly what happened with several controversial figures in Egyptian history. One of the most famous was Hatshepsut. She became one of Egypt's most successful female rulers. She expanded trade. She sponsored enormous building projects. She erected monuments. She presented herself as a legitimate king. And after her death, many of her images and names were damaged or removed. For a long time, historians struggled to understand why. Was it revenge? Politics? Dynastic legitimacy? Or something more complicated? The answer remains debated. But one thing is certain. The attempt to erase Hatshepsut did not work. Her monuments survived. Her statues survived. Her temple survived. Her name survived. And eventually, her story returned. This is one of the great ironies of ancient Egypt. The people who tried to control memory could not control archaeology. The sand preserved evidence they never expected future generations to find. And the same thing happened to Nefertiti. Her name became famous through surviving images and inscriptions. Her distinctive appearance became one of the most recognizable faces from the ancient world. But her mummy remains uncertain. For decades, researchers have searched for the physical remains of the queen. Several possibilities have been proposed. Some have been investigated. Others have been rejected. And the mystery continues. Imagine what would happen if Nefertiti's mummy were definitively identified. Scientists could examine her bones, her teeth, her age, her health, her genetic relationships, her embalming methods, her physical characteristics. Modern technology could reveal more about her than ancient Egyptians ever recorded. A CT scan could show injuries hidden beneath the wrappings. DNA could clarify family relationships. Chemical analysis could reveal diet. Isotopes could potentially provide information about where she grew up or lived. And suddenly, a woman who existed more than 3,000 years ago could become almost human again. Not a statue, not a name, not a legend, a person. That is one of the strange powers of mummy science. It turns history into biology. A king becomes a skeleton. A queen becomes teeth and bone. A priest becomes evidence. A doctor becomes a set of inscriptions. The mystery becomes physical. And sometimes the physical evidence contradicts the historical image. Tutankhamun is perhaps the most famous example. For generations, he was remembered primarily as the boy king whose tomb contained extraordinary treasures. But modern research revealed something more complicated. His body showed evidence of health problems. His bones suggested physical difficulties. Genetic analysis provided information about his family. Evidence of malaria was found. The young pharaoh was not the perfect golden ruler represented in his royal imagery. He was a human being, a teenager who suffered from illness. And perhaps this is one reason his story feels so powerful. Behind the gold was a fragile human body. Behind the monument was a teenager. Behind the legend was a person who died thousands of years ago. The same pattern appears with Ramses II. He was one of the most powerful pharaohs in Egyptian history. His monuments show him as enormous, victorious, and almost divine. But his mummy tells another story. He lived to an unusually old age. His skeleton shows signs of age and disease. His body reveals the physical reality behind the propaganda. This is why mummies are so valuable. Monuments can lie. Kings can exaggerate. Artists can idealize. But bones often tell a different story. A ruler can claim to have conquered everything. A skeleton can reveal how difficult his final years actually were. A royal portrait can show perfect health. Teeth can reveal disease. The body becomes a witness. and witnesses sometimes contradict the official story. This is especially important when studying ancient medicine. For years, historians relied heavily on written medical texts. Now they can compare those texts with physical evidence. Did Egyptian physicians really treat certain injuries? Did people survive surgery? Were infections common? What did people eat? What diseases affected them? What happened to their teeth? The answers are buried inside the bodies, and sometimes the results are extraordinary. Ancient skulls have shown evidence of trauma and attempted treatment. Bones reveal healed fractures. Prosthetic devices reveal attempts to restore mobility. Dental remains reveal severe wear. Mummies reveal parasites and infections. The dead become a medical archive. An archive that was never intended to exist for scientists, but survived anyway. Yet perhaps the most remarkable thing about Egyptian archaeology is how often the dead continue to influence the living. The pyramids still dominate the landscape. The temples still attract visitors. The statues still stare across thousands of years. The names of kings are spoken again. The hieroglyphs are translated. The forgotten are remembered. In a strange way, the Egyptians succeeded. They wanted their names to survive. They wanted their stories to continue. They wanted their bodies protected. And they wanted their journey to eternity to be remembered. Thousands of years later, we are still doing exactly that. But there is a darker side. The same fascination that allows us to study the past has also caused enormous damage. Tombs were robbed. Mummies were unwrapped. Bodies were cut open. Artifacts were removed. Human remains were displayed. Sometimes researchers acted with the best intentions. Sometimes they did not. The history of archaeology is filled with decisions that would be considered unacceptable today. The treatment of Tutankhamun's mummy is a reminder. Researchers wanted answers. They wanted to examine the famous king. But the methods available to them were destructive. Today, the philosophy is changing. Preserve first. Study carefully. Use technology whenever possible. Do not destroy what cannot be replaced. That principle is becoming increasingly important. Because every mummy is unique. There is no second copy. Once a body is damaged, the information lost may be gone forever. That is why CT scanning, 3D imaging, digital reconstruction, and other non-invasive techniques are so valuable. They allow us to look without touching, to investigate without destroying, to hear the ancient message without tearing apart the messenger. And perhaps that is the direction archaeology is heading. The future may not be about opening every tomb. It may be about learning how to leave them closed. Because sometimes the mystery itself is part of the evidence. A sealed chamber can tell us something. An untouched mummy can tell us something. A missing body can tell us something. An empty tomb can tell us something. Even a damaged inscription can tell us something. Every absence has a story. And Egypt is filled with absences. Lost tombs, lost names, lost rulers, lost texts, lost treasures, lost bodies. But every generation of archaeologists finds another fragment. And each fragment brings us closer to understanding the civilization that created one of the most elaborate systems of death ever imagined. They believed death was a journey. They prepared for it. They wrote instructions. They built monuments. They preserved bodies. They surrounded the dead with protection. And they left their words behind. Perhaps they believed those words would guide them forever. They could never have imagined that thousands of years later, strangers from another world would stand inside their tombs, shine lights across their walls, and try to understand what they were afraid of. Maybe that is the real mystery. Not whether the Egyptians knew what awaited them after death, but why they were so desperate to make sure. They were ready for it. There is a moment in every archaeological discovery when the excitement suddenly turns into something much more unsettling. The researchers stop looking at the objects. They stop thinking about dates and measurements. And they realize they are looking at the final moments of a human life. A skull with a healed fracture. A tooth worn down by years of grinding. A mummy wrapped in linen. A name carved into stone. A coffin waiting in darkness. These are not simply artifacts. They are people. People who laughed. People who became sick. People who loved someone. People who feared something. And eventually, people who died. Ancient Egypt gives us an unusual opportunity to meet those people again. Not face to face, but through the traces they left behind. And the more technology advances, the more personal these discoveries become. For a long time, archaeologists could tell us where a mummy was found. They could estimate its age. They could study its coffin. They could translate its name. But today, researchers can go much deeper. They can examine the chemical composition of bones. They can reconstruct faces. They can identify diseases. They can investigate family relationships. They can even analyze ancient DNA. Suddenly, the dead are no longer anonymous. They become individuals. One of the clearest examples is the ancient Iceman discovered in the Alps. When his body emerged from the ice, researchers initially thought they had found a modern mountaineer. But the truth was far older. He lived more than 5,000 years ago. His body had been naturally preserved by the freezing environment. His clothes survived. His tools survived. His stomach contents survived. Even tattoos remained visible on his skin, and his body became a time capsule. Researchers learned that he had eaten shortly before his death. They discovered evidence of physical stress. They found signs of disease. They identified injuries. They even learned that he had probably traveled with carefully maintained tools. The Iceman was no longer simply a mummy. He became a man with a story. And then came the most disturbing realization. He had not simply died of old age. Evidence suggested that he had suffered a violent injury. A projectile had entered his body. He had been wounded. And suddenly the frozen corpse became a crime scene from 5,000 years ago. Who attacked him? Why? Was he escaping? Was he ambushed? Was he involved in a conflict? We may never know, but his body preserved the evidence. Ancient Egypt contains similar stories. Sometimes the evidence is hidden beneath layers of linen. A wound, a broken bone, a damaged tooth, a surgical cut, a disease, a chemical trace. The mummy becomes a silent witness. And this is where modern archaeology becomes almost forensic. Researchers can examine trauma patterns. They can identify injuries that happened before death. They can distinguish healed wounds from fatal ones. They can determine whether certain treatments were successful. They can compare diseases across populations. The dead can tell us what life was really like, not the idealized version painted on temple walls. The real version. The version where people suffered, where children became sick, where workers were injured, where teeth decayed, where infections spread, where childbirth could become deadly, and where medicine had limits. This is important because ancient Egyptian art often presents an almost perfect world. Pharaohs are young, strong, powerful, beautiful. They defeat enemies. They receive offerings from gods. They stand taller than everyone else. But the bodies tell a different story. The bodies reveal aging, pain, disease, and vulnerability. Even the most powerful pharaoh could not escape biology. Ramses II ruled for decades. He commanded armies. He built enormous monuments. He projected an image of unstoppable strength. But eventually, his body aged. His bones changed. His teeth deteriorated. His body became fragile. Death came for him just as it came for everyone else. The same was true for Tutankhamun. He had the wealth of a king, the protection of priests, the finest burial equipment, a golden coffin, a magnificent tomb, but none of it could save him. He died young, and that fact is perhaps the most haunting part of his story. The ancient Egyptians spent enormous effort preparing for death, yet even they could not prevent it. They could only prepare for what came afterward. This is why the tomb was so important. The tomb was not merely a place to put a body. It was the center of an entire system. The body was preserved. The name was recorded. Offerings were provided. Images were painted. Spells were written. The deceased was surrounded by everything believed necessary for eternal existence: food, clothing, jewelry, weapons, furniture, cosmetics, perfume, tools, games, even transportation. A royal tomb could resemble an entire household frozen in time. And that is exactly what makes tomb robbery so devastating. A tomb robber did not simply steal valuable objects. They disrupted an entire afterlife system. When offerings disappeared, the deceased could theoretically suffer. When a mummy was damaged, its spiritual identity could be threatened. When a name was destroyed, memory itself was attacked. From the Egyptian perspective, robbing a tomb was therefore much more serious than ordinary theft. It was an assault on eternity. Yet tomb robbery became common. The treasures were simply too valuable. Gold, precious stones, perfumes, fine furniture, ceremonial objects. Even the materials used in burial could be reused. A coffin could become another coffin. A tomb could be reopened. A mummy could be moved. Royal burials could be hidden in secret locations. And this is exactly what happened to many pharaohs. Bodies were transferred. Burials were reorganized. Priests moved royal mummies to protect them. Centuries later, archaeologists discovered groups of royal mummies hidden together. One of the most important discoveries occurred at Deir el-Bahari. There, researchers found the remains of numerous rulers and high-ranking individuals. Among them were some of Egypt's most famous pharaohs. The discovery changed our understanding of what happened after the royal tombs were looted. The priests did not simply abandon the kings. They tried to save them. They gathered them. They rewrapped them. They recorded their identities, and they hid them. It was an ancient rescue operation. The kings had lost their original tombs, but they had not completely lost their identities. This pattern appears again and again in Egyptian history. Destruction followed by preservation. Loss followed by recovery. Forgetting followed by rediscovery. It is almost as if Egypt continually buried its own history, only for future generations to dig it back up. And perhaps nowhere is this more obvious than at Saqqara. For thousands of years, this enormous necropolis continued to expand. Tombs were built, bodies were buried, temples were constructed. New generations added their dead to the landscape. Then the site was abandoned. Sand covered it. Buildings collapsed. The desert slowly swallowed the evidence. Centuries passed. Then archaeologists returned. They discovered one tomb, then another, and suddenly, the buried landscape began to reappear. The modern excavations at Saqqara have produced an astonishing variety of discoveries. Priests, officials, animals, mummies, statues, coffins, medical evidence, religious texts, and sometimes completely unexpected individuals. The discovery of the Dr. Teti Neb Fu is a perfect example. His physical remains were gone. His tomb had been robbed, but his identity survived through the inscriptions. His titles revealed a specialist whose knowledge crossed several fields: medicine, plants, dentistry, protection against venom. That information gives us something priceless: a glimpse into the professional world of ancient Egypt. He was not a legendary king. He was not a conqueror. He was a healer. And because his tomb survived, we can still hear his name. That is perhaps one of the greatest achievements of archaeology. It gives ordinary history back to people who were almost forgotten. Not everyone built pyramids. Not everyone ruled armies. Not everyone became a god. Most people lived ordinary lives. They worked. They ate. They raised families. They became sick. They grew old. And they died. But their stories are hidden in the archaeological record. A damaged skeleton, a humble burial, a tool, a bowl, a few words. Sometimes that is all we have. And yet, those fragments can tell us more about ancient life than a giant statue ever could. Because a statue shows us what someone wanted to be remembered as. A skeleton shows us what actually happened to their body. A tomb inscription shows us what they believed. A medical text shows us what they knew. And the combination of all three gives us something much closer to reality. But there is still one mystery that refuses to disappear. What happened to the consciousness of these people? The Egyptians had elaborate answers. The Ka, the Ba, the Ak, the Judgement, Osiris, the fields of paradise, the journey through the Duat. They believed death was transformation. Modern science cannot confirm any of it. But archaeology can confirm one thing. They believed it deeply. They invested enormous amounts of time, wealth, labor, and creativity into preparing for it. That belief shaped their civilization. It influenced architecture, medicine, art, writing, politics, religion, even geography. The Western Desert became associated with death because the sun disappeared there each evening. The Eastern horizon represented birth because the sun returned there. The cycle of the sun became a model for human existence. Every night, darkness. Every morning, rebirth. Perhaps this is why Egyptian civilization remained fascinated by the sun. It was not just a source of light. It was proof. Every morning, the universe demonstrated that disappearance did not necessarily mean destruction. Something could vanish and return. That idea became central to Egyptian concepts of death. The dead could disappear from the world of the living and still return in another form. Maybe that is why the Egyptians were so obsessed with preservation. They were not simply fighting decay. They were trying to participate in the cosmic cycle. Death was part of the natural order, but destruction was not. The body had to survive. The name had to survive. The memory had to survive. The ritual had to continue. And if all of those things remained intact, perhaps the person could live forever. Thousands of years later, we are unknowingly participating in that same system. Every time we read the name of an ancient pharaoh, we preserve the name. Every time a museum displays a mummy, we remember the person. Every time archaeologists translate a forgotten inscription, the ancient voice returns. The Egyptians wanted eternity. They built for it. They wrote for it. They prepared for it. And somehow, they achieved a version of it. Not the eternal life they imagined, but something almost as strange. They became impossible to forget. Their cities disappeared. Their temples collapsed. Their tombs were robbed. Their names were erased. Their bodies were damaged. Their language became silent. And yet, after thousands of years, they are still here, still speaking, still watching from the walls, still waiting beneath the sand. And perhaps that is why the newest discoveries are so exciting. Because somewhere beneath the desert may be another tomb, another name, another forgotten life, another message. And maybe, one day, someone will uncover a sentence that forces us to rethink everything we thought we knew about the ancient world. Because in Egypt, the past is never truly dead. It is only buried. If there is one thing the ancient Egyptians understood better than almost anyone, it was this: death does not necessarily begin when the heart stops beating. For them, death was a journey. A dangerous journey through darkness, judgment, spirits, gods, gates, and forces that could not be seen by the living. And somewhere along that journey, a person could disappear completely. Not physically, but from memory. And perhaps that is why the oldest messages we have found are not simply records of what happened. They are instructions, warnings, prayers, names carved into stone with an almost desperate determination to survive thousands of years. Because the ancient Egyptians believed that as long as your name was remembered, a part of you continued to exist. And now, after thousands of years, we can finally read many of those words. But the more we understand them, the stranger they become. The hieroglyphs that once appeared to us as beautiful pictures are actually fragments of a much darker world. A world where the dead had to know secret names, speak the correct words, pass through supernatural gates, and prove that they were worthy of entering eternity. And hidden among those messages is a disturbing idea. What if the ancient Egyptians were not simply trying to explain the afterlife? What if they were trying to warn the living about it? The discovery at Saqqara brings this question back into focus. Deep beneath the desert, the tomb of Teti Neb-Fu preserved a world that should have disappeared thousands of years ago. His body was gone, his burial had been disturbed, and whatever treasures once accompanied him had largely vanished. But the walls remained, and that may have been the most important thing of all. Because gold can be stolen, wood can rot, bones can disappear, but words carved into stone can survive. Teti Neb-Fu's inscriptions tell us that this man was far more than an ordinary physician. He was associated with medicine, medicinal plants, dentistry, and the mysterious protection of Serket, the scorpion goddess connected with venom and healing. To us, that combination may seem strange. Medicine on one side, magic on the other. But to the Egyptians, there was no contradiction. A disease could be physical and spiritual at the same time. A wound could require treatment and a spell. A poisonous bite could demand both knowledge of nature and protection from the supernatural. Their doctors observed symptoms. They prepared medicines. They treated wounds. They understood the importance of cleanliness, bandaging, splints, and surgery. But they also believed that invisible forces could influence the body. And that is where the hieroglyphs become so fascinating. They were not merely writing, they were performing. The ancient Egyptians believed words had power. To write the name of a person was to preserve that person. To write the name of a god was to invoke that god. To write a spell was, in a sense, to give that spell a path into reality. This is why destroying someone's name could be considered a terrifying punishment. If the name disappeared, the person's memory could disappear with it. And if the memory disappeared, what remained? That question may explain why Egyptian tombs are covered with names. Names of kings, names of gods, names of servants, names of offerings, names of places, names of things that the deceased might need. The tomb was almost like a machine built to defeat forgetting. And that machine had one enemy: time. Thousands of years passed. Kingdoms collapsed. Languages changed. Temples were buried. Tombs were robbed. Dynasties disappeared. And eventually, the people who created these symbols were gone. Their descendants could no longer understand the language of the monuments. The hieroglyphs became silent. For centuries, scholars could look directly at the walls of Egypt and see thousands of symbols without knowing what they truly meant. Then everything changed. The Rosetta Stone gave scholars the key. The work of Jean-François Champollion helped unlock the ancient Egyptian writing system, revealing that hieroglyphs were not simply pictures. They could represent sounds, ideas, and words. Suddenly, the silent walls began to speak again. And what they said was extraordinary. They spoke about gods. They spoke about kings. They spoke about medicine. They spoke about war. They spoke about rituals. And above all, they spoke about death. One of the most fascinating discoveries was that the ancient Egyptians had created elaborate instructions for navigating the world beyond life. Modern people often call these collections the Book of the Dead. But that name can be misleading. These were not simply stories about dead people. They were collections of spells, formulas, and instructions intended to help the deceased survive the dangers of the afterlife. Imagine dying and waking up in a world where you do not know where you are. There are doors. There are guardians. There are creatures. There are gods. And before every gate, you may be required to know a name. Not just your own. The name of the gate, the name of its guardian, the correct words to speak, the correct answers to give. One mistake could mean failure. And then comes the most famous scene of all, the judgment of the heart. The deceased stands before Osiris. Their heart is placed on a scale. On the other side is the feather of Ma'at, representing truth, balance, and cosmic order. If the heart is too heavy with wrongdoing, it fails the test. And waiting nearby is Ammit, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. A creature created from the most terrifying animals imaginable. Ammit does not simply kill the unworthy. She consumes them. Their existence is erased. No paradise, no eternal life, no second chance. Just oblivion. And suddenly, those ancient inscriptions seem much more terrifying. Because the greatest fear was not death itself. It was the possibility of being forgotten, of being erased, of having no place in eternity. This may also explain something strange about Egyptian medicine. Why preserve the body so carefully? Why spend 70 days preparing a corpse? Why remove internal organs? Why dry the body with natron? Why wrap it in linen? Why place food, clothing, jewelry, oils, tools, and sometimes even furniture inside a tomb? Because the body was not considered meaningless after death. It was part of the person's identity. The physical body, the name, the memory, and the spiritual elements all had roles to play. Destroy one part, and the journey could become more dangerous. That belief explains the obsession with preservation. And it explains why the discovery of an ancient mummy can still feel so powerful today. When scientists scan a mummy, they are not simply examining bones. They are reconstructing a life. They can discover what someone ate. They can identify diseases. They can see healed injuries. They can sometimes determine how old a person was when they died. Modern technology has transformed the way we approach these ancient remains. CT scanners can look inside bodies without unwrapping them. DNA can reveal family relationships. Chemical analysis can identify medicines, oils, pigments, and residues. And suddenly, people who died thousands of years ago begin to feel strangely close. The royal physician becomes more than a name. The pharaoh becomes more than a statue. The mummy becomes more than an archaeological object. They become people. People who suffered. People who became sick. People who loved. People who feared death. People who desperately wanted to be remembered. And perhaps that is the real message hidden inside the hieroglyphs. Not a supernatural prophecy. Not proof of a curse. Not a prediction of some terrifying event waiting for humanity. Something much more human. The Egyptians knew that everything disappears eventually. Empires disappear, cities disappear, kings disappear. Even gods can be forgotten. But they believed that words could fight against that process. They carved their names into stone because they wanted someone, somewhere, someday, to remember that they existed. And look at what happened. Thousands of years later, we are still saying their names. Teti-Neb-Fu, Osiris, Serket, Tutankhamun, Ramesses, Hatshepsut, Nefertiti. The names survived. The people survived through memory. And perhaps the most terrifying part is that their strategy worked. We found their tombs. We opened their temples. We translated their warnings. We read their prayers. We reconstructed their medicine. We studied their bodies. And now, we are listening. But there is still a mystery. We have decoded many hieroglyphs. We have translated countless inscriptions. We have learned how the ancient Egyptians described the gods, the body, the afterlife, and the journey beyond death. Yet we still cannot answer the question that matters most. Did they actually believe they had discovered something real? Were the gates, guardians, judgments, and supernatural dangers simply religious symbolism? Or were these descriptions based on experiences we can no longer understand? Archaeology cannot prove an afterlife. Science cannot confirm the existence of Egyptian gods, and no translation can tell us what happens after the final heartbeat. But it can tell us what the ancient Egyptians believed. And those beliefs were powerful enough to shape an entire civilization. They built monuments that still dominate the landscape. They created medical traditions that continue to surprise researchers. They developed writing systems capable of preserving complex ideas. And they turned tombs into messages for people they would never meet. For thousands of years, those messages waited in darkness. Then, the desert gave them back. Maybe that is why the discovery of an ancient inscription feels different from discovering ordinary writing. Because when you read a message from 3,000 years ago, you are not simply reading history. You are hearing a voice that was never supposed to reach you. A voice from someone who knew they would die. Someone who knew their civilization might eventually disappear. Someone who carved words into stone anyway. And perhaps the terrifying message was never about monsters. It was never about curses. It was never about the gods coming back. Maybe the message was much simpler. Remember us. Because one day, someone will forget you too. And when the last monument falls, when the final tomb is buried, when the final name disappears from human memory, there may be nothing left, except the words. And somehow, after more than 3,000 years, those words are still here, still waiting, still speaking. And now that we can finally understand them, the ancient Egyptians have one final question for us. When our own civilization is gone, who will remember our names? Okay, discovering a message written more than 3,000 years ago. A message carved into stone by people who believed they understood what happens after death. At first, the symbols seem beautiful. Birds, eyes, scorpions, gods, kings, strange figures standing beside mysterious objects. But then the symbols begin to make sense. And what they reveal is not a simple prayer for the dead. It is a warning. A warning about sickness, death, the journey into the underworld, and something the ancient Egyptians believed could happen to a person long after their body had been buried. The disturbing part is that this message was never meant for us. It was meant for someone who was already dead. So why does it feel as if the ancient Egyptians were speaking directly to the living? Deep beneath the golden sands of Saqqara, where the remains of ancient pyramids rise from the desert like shadows of another world, archaeologists recently uncovered a tomb belonging to a man who lived more than 4,000 years ago. His name was Teti-Neb-Fu, and judging by the titles carved into the walls, he was no ordinary man. He was a healer. But not simply a healer in the way we understand doctors today. He was connected to medicine, sacred rituals, dangerous poisons, medicinal plants, and the mysterious forces that ancient Egyptians believed surrounded illness and death. His tomb contained vivid paintings that had somehow survived thousands of years underground. The colors were still striking, the inscriptions were still visible, and the walls preserved details about a forgotten world in which medicine and magic were not separate disciplines. Then came the strangest part. There was no body. The tomb had been robbed long ago, leaving behind none of the treasures that might normally identify the status of such an important individual. But the thieves could not steal everything. They left the walls behind. And those walls became the real treasure. Because carved into the stone were clues about the man who once occupied this tomb. Teti-Neb-Fu carried an extraordinary title connected to Serket, the ancient scorpion goddess. To modern eyes, a scorpion might represent nothing more than danger. To the Egyptians, it was far more complicated. Serket was associated with venom, protection, healing, and the power to stop deadly poison. A creature capable of killing could also become a symbol of protection against death itself. That tells us something important about ancient Egyptian medicine. For them, healing was never purely physical. A physician could examine a wound, prepare herbs, treat an infection, or work on damaged teeth. But at the same time, that same healer might recite sacred words intended to protect the patient from invisible forces. A treatment could involve both an ingredient and an incantation. A doctor could be part scientist, part priest, and part magician. And Teti-Neb-Fu appears to have stood unusually high within this world. Another inscription describes him as a director of medicinal plants. This title is exceptionally rare. It suggests that he possessed knowledge of plants, roots, oils, and other substances used for healing. In a civilization surrounded by desert, such knowledge could be incredibly valuable. But there was another title. He was also associated with dentistry. That might sound almost ordinary today. But in ancient Egypt, specialized medical roles were surprisingly advanced. The Egyptians suffered from serious dental problems, partly because grains and food could contain tiny particles of sand that gradually destroyed their teeth. Their bread was often gritty. Over time, that grit could wear down enamel until the teeth became severely damaged. So the same civilization that built monumental pyramids was also struggling with something much more familiar: toothache. They developed mixtures intended to clean the mouth. They used plants and minerals. They attempted treatments for damaged teeth. And evidence from ancient remains suggests that some physicians were capable of performing surprisingly complex procedures. This creates an extraordinary picture of Teti-Neb-Fu. He wasn't simply a man who knew a few herbs. He may have been one of the most highly trained medical specialists of his age. And yet, his tomb does not contain his body. Only his words remain. That absence changes the entire mystery. If the body had survived, archaeologists could examine his bones, determine his age, search for signs of disease, and perhaps learn how he died. Instead, the man himself has disappeared into history. What remains is the portrait he left behind through stone, pigment, symbols, and titles. And this is where ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs become more than an ancient writing system. They become a voice from the dead. To modern people, hieroglyphs can look like mysterious pictures. A bird might be a bird. An eye might be an eye. A seated figure might simply represent a person. But ancient Egyptian writing was far more sophisticated. Symbols could represent sounds, ideas, objects, names, religious concepts, and entire phrases, depending on how they were used. A single inscription could tell a story. It could identify a person. It could describe their profession. It could call upon a god. It could protect a tomb. And sometimes, It could describe what the Egyptians believed would happen after the final breath. That last part is where things become darker. The Egyptians did not see death as the end. They believed existence continued, but only if the dead person was properly prepared. The body had to be preserved. The tomb had to be protected. The correct rituals had to be performed. Sacred words had to be spoken. And the deceased needed guidance for the journey beyond the world of the living. That is why the walls of Egyptian tombs are filled with instructions, prayers, names, spells, images, and warnings. The dead were not simply buried. They were prepared for a journey. And according to Egyptian belief, that journey was dangerous. The deceased would encounter divine beings, gates, creatures, judgment, and forces that could prevent the soul from reaching its destination. The right words could provide protection. The wrong preparation could mean something much worse. Imagine believing that the difference between eternal existence and complete destruction could depend on whether the correct words were written on a wall. Now imagine finding those words thousands of years later. That is the real power of hieroglyphs. They survived because stone remembers. Kings disappeared. Priests disappeared. Physicians disappeared. Entire cities were buried. But their words remained. And sometimes those words tell us something deeply unsettling about what ancient people feared most. Not monsters, not curses, not even death itself. They feared being forgotten. Because in ancient Egypt, a person's name was more than a label. To preserve someone's name was, in a sense, to preserve part of their existence. If the name continued to be spoken, written, and remembered, the person could continue to exist in the world beyond the grave. Perhaps that is why the tomb of Teti-Neb-Fu is so fascinating. His body is gone. His treasures are gone. Much of his physical existence has disappeared. But his name remains. His titles remain. His symbols remain. And thousands of years later, we are still reading them. The ancient Egyptians believed that words had power. They believed names could preserve existence and sacred texts could protect the dead. They believed a carefully written spell could cross the boundary between life and death. But there is one question we have not answered yet. If these inscriptions were powerful enough to guide the dead into the afterlife, what exactly were they trying to protect them from? Because once archaeologists began decoding the ancient language of Egypt, they discovered that some of the oldest messages were not simply beautiful prayers. They were instructions. They were formulas. They were warnings. And buried among them was an ancient understanding of death that would make the world of the living look very different. The deeper we go into those words, the stranger the story becomes. The terrifying message may not be about what happens after you die. It may be about what happens if you are forgotten. For thousands of years, the symbols remained silent. They were carved into stone, painted across walls, written on fragile sheets of papyrus, and hidden inside tombs beneath layers of sand. To the people who created them, these symbols were not decoration. They were instructions for survival beyond death. But when the civilization that created them disappeared, the meaning of those words became locked away with it. Then, centuries later, something extraordinary happened. The dead began to speak again. The key was not a mysterious artifact or a supernatural discovery. It was language itself. For generations, scholars could see Egyptian hieroglyphs but could not understand them. The symbols were everywhere, staring down from temples and tombs, but their meaning remained hidden. A civilization that had recorded the names of kings, the victories of armies, the rituals of priests, and the secrets of medicine had effectively become mute. Then came the breakthrough. The Rosetta Stone changed everything. Discovered in 1799, the stone contained the same decree written in 3 different scripts. One was ancient Greek. Another was Demotic, a later Egyptian script. The third was hieroglyphic. Greek could already be read. And that meant scholars finally had something they could compare against the mysterious symbols. The work was painstaking. Researchers searched for repeated names. They compared symbols. They looked for patterns. They studied how sounds could be represented. And eventually, the ancient Egyptian writing system began to open. One of the men who played a decisive role was Jean-François Champollion. He realized that hieroglyphs were not simply pictures representing objects. Some represented sounds. Others represented concepts. Some clarified the meaning of words. The system was far more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Suddenly, the walls of Egypt began to speak. And what they said was extraordinary. They told us about kings who ruled thousands of years ago. They recorded wars, religious ceremonies, offerings, royal marriages, medical knowledge, taxes, farming, trade, and everyday life. But there was another category of text. The texts written for the dead. These were some of the most important words in the entire Egyptian civilization. Because to the Egyptians, dying was not the end of the story. It was a transition. The body might be placed inside a coffin, but the individual was believed to continue existing through several spiritual aspects. The Egyptians had an incredibly complex understanding of identity, and the afterlife was not imagined as a simple paradise waiting behind a door. The dead had to navigate it, and navigation required knowledge. This is why funerary texts could be so detailed. They described gates, gods, guardians, dangerous creatures, sacred names, passwords, rituals, and spells. They were essentially maps of the unseen world. Imagine entering a place you have never seen before, knowing that you have only one chance to reach the other side. Now imagine someone handing you a map. That was the purpose of many Egyptian funerary texts. But there was a problem. Not everyone received the same map. During the earliest periods of Egyptian history, many of these sacred texts were reserved primarily for kings. The words were placed inside royal tombs because the pharaoh was believed to have a special role in maintaining the cosmic order of Egypt. Eventually, funerary knowledge became more widely available. Texts appeared on coffins, then on papyri. Eventually, what we call the Book of the Dead became one of the most famous collections of funerary spells in ancient Egypt. But the name can be misleading. It wasn't really a single book. There was no fixed ancient Egyptian volume called the Book of the Dead with exactly the same pages for everyone. Instead, it was a collection of spells and instructions that could be selected and arranged according to the needs of the deceased. Some were intended to protect the body. Others helped the deceased transform into different forms. Some provided words to speak before divine beings. And some addressed the most terrifying moment of all: judgment. According to Egyptian belief, the deceased would eventually face a divine tribunal. At the center of this judgment stood Osiris, the god associated with death, resurrection, and the afterlife. But the dead person was not simply asked whether they had been good or bad. Their heart was placed on a scale. On the other side was the feather of Ma'at. Ma'at represented truth, justice, balance, and cosmic order. The heart had to be in harmony with that principle. If the heart was too heavy with wrongdoing, the consequences could be catastrophic. A creature known as Ammit waited nearby. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus. Her name is often translated as devourer. And she was not a demon in the modern sense. She was something far more frightening. She represented the destruction of the unworthy dead. If the deceased failed judgment, Ammit could consume the heart. The individual would then lose the possibility of continuing into the afterlife. In other words, the greatest Egyptian fear was not simply dying. It was failing to exist after death. And suddenly, the inscriptions inside tombs make more sense. They were not just prayers. They were protection. They were preparation. They were an attempt to give the dead every possible advantage in a journey that the living could not physically observe. But this raises another disturbing question. Why were some spells so specific? Why did the dead need to know the names of certain gods? Why were secret words included? Why did some texts describe particular gates and guardians? And why did the Egyptians believe that simply knowing a name could give a person power? The answer takes us back to the ancient Egyptian understanding of language. Words were not always considered passive descriptions. They could have power. To name something was to recognize it. To know its name was, in some contexts, to gain a form of control over it. This belief appears again and again in Egyptian religious texts, and it may explain why names were treated with extraordinary care. A king's name could be carved repeatedly into stone. A person's name could be placed inside a tomb. And destroying someone's name could be considered an attack on their existence. This is why later rulers sometimes attempted to erase the names of their predecessors. They were not simply removing words from monuments. They were attacking memory. And memory was connected to eternity. This becomes particularly important when we return to the tombs of Egypt, because many of them were not designed simply to hide a body. They were designed to preserve identity. The paintings showed the deceased receiving offerings. The inscriptions named them. The objects surrounding them reflected their status. The food represented continued nourishment. The jewelry offered protection. The spells provided instructions. Everything had a purpose. The tomb became a bridge between two worlds. And perhaps that explains why ancient Egyptians spent enormous resources building places for the dead. They were not simply constructing monuments. They were constructing eternity. But there was one thing even the Egyptians could not completely control: time. Stone could survive for thousands of years, but humans could not. Paint could fade. Tombs could flood. Grave robbers could break through sealed chambers. Mummies could decay. Names could disappear beneath collapsing temples. And sometimes, the only thing left behind was a wall covered in symbols. That is exactly what happened to countless individuals whose bodies are now gone. Their treasures disappeared. Their tombs were damaged. Their identities were forgotten. But fragments of their words survived. And when modern archaeologists finally learned how to read those words, they discovered something remarkable. Ancient Egypt was not a civilization obsessed only with death. It was a civilization obsessed with defeating death. Medicine, religion, architecture, embalming, writing, mathematics, and ritual were all connected by the same enormous question: how can human existence continue when the body stops? The tomb of Teti-Neb-Fu gives us a rare glimpse into one part of that answer. He was a healer, a specialist, a man trusted with knowledge of plants, disease, venom, and the human body. Yet his profession existed inside a culture where physical illness could also have a spiritual dimension. A patient could require medicine, but they could also require protection. A wound could be treated with an ingredient, but a spell might accompany the treatment. The boundary between science and religion was not where we would draw it today. And that is one reason ancient Egyptian medicine is so fascinating. Some of their treatments seem surprisingly practical. Others sound strange. Some ingredients were genuinely useful. Others were probably ineffective. But behind all of them was the same attempt to understand the human body and preserve life. And when preserving life failed, they turned their attention to preserving the dead. Perhaps that is the real connection between the doctor in Saqqara and the mysterious inscriptions surrounding ancient tombs. One dealt with the living, the other dealt with the dead. But both were trying to accomplish the same impossible task: to hold back the darkness. And the deeper archaeologists dig, the more evidence they find that ancient Egyptians were willing to go to extraordinary lengths to accomplish it. They built enormous tombs. They preserved bodies. They created spells. They buried food. They surrounded the dead with protective symbols. They even attempted to recreate the world the deceased had left behind. But there was one final defense: the name. As long as someone remembered who you were not completely gone. And perhaps that is why, more than 3,000 years later, we are still saying the names of ancient kings, physicians, queens, and priests. Because every time we read their inscriptions, something remarkable happens. For a brief moment, the dead become alive again. The dead become alive again. Not physically, not in the way ancient legends promised, but through memory. A name carved into stone can survive longer than a body ever could. A face painted on a tomb wall can outlast the civilization that created it. And a few lines of hieroglyphs can preserve the thoughts of a person who disappeared thousands of years ago. But there is a darker side to this idea. Because if words could preserve a person, then perhaps words could also destroy them. In ancient Egypt, memory was power. A king who remained remembered could continue to exist in the sacred world. A person whose name was erased risked something far worse than historical obscurity. Their identity could disappear completely. This is why ancient Egyptians treated inscriptions with such extraordinary importance. And it is also why some of the most mysterious messages in Egypt were hidden in places where almost nobody would ever see them. Deep inside tombs, behind sealed doors, inside chambers designed to remain untouched for eternity. One of those places was Saqqara. For thousands of years, the desert surrounding Saqqara concealed the remains of priests, officials, physicians, craftsmen, and rulers. Above the ground, enormous monuments announced the power of the ancient kingdom. Below the ground, another world waited. A world of corridors, chambers, shafts, burial rooms, and inscriptions. And somewhere within this enormous landscape, a man named Teti Nebfu was waiting to be remembered. His tomb was not filled with the kind of treasure that usually captures the public imagination. There was no untouched pile of gold, no spectacular royal mask, no perfectly preserved mummy waiting beneath a sealed coffin. The tomb had already been robbed. But the thieves made one mistake. They left the walls. And the walls contained something far more valuable than gold. They contained information. The inscriptions identified Teti Nebfu and revealed a man whose responsibilities stretched across several unusual areas of ancient Egyptian medicine. One title connected him to Serket, the scorpion goddess. Another connected him to medicinal plants. Another pointed toward dentistry. These titles may seem like simple labels, but they reveal something profound. Ancient Egyptian medicine was not a single profession. It was a collection of specialized skills. Some physicians focused on the eyes. Others dealt with the stomach. Some treated wounds. Others specialized in particular diseases. And some worked with teeth and jaws. This specialization becomes even more remarkable when we consider how difficult medicine was in a world without modern hospitals, antibiotics, anesthesia, microscopes, or advanced imaging. A simple injury could become fatal. An infected wound could kill. A broken bone could permanently disable someone. A venomous bite could end a life within hours. And yet, ancient Egyptian healers developed treatments based on observation, experience, and accumulated knowledge. They knew that some plants had useful properties. They understood the importance of cleaning and dressing wounds. They used bandages, splints, oils, resins, and various preparations. They also performed procedures that modern researchers continue to investigate. But their medicine existed alongside religion. And that is where the story becomes more mysterious. Imagine being bitten by a venomous creature in ancient Egypt. A modern doctor might immediately focus on the biological effects of the venom. An ancient Egyptian healer could do the same in his own way. But he might also call upon Serket, because to the ancient Egyptians, the physical and spiritual worlds were deeply connected. The scorpion could represent death. but the goddess associated with the scorpion could also protect against it. The same symbol could represent danger and protection at the same time. This duality appears throughout Egyptian religion: death and resurrection, darkness and sunlight, decay and renewal, destruction and creation. The Egyptians observed these cycles everywhere. The sun disappeared every evening and returned every morning. The Nile flooded and receded. Plants died and grew again. Animals reproduced. Humans were born, lived, and died. To them, nature itself appeared to be telling the same story. Death was not necessarily an ending, it was a transition. And this belief shaped almost everything they built, including their tombs. The tomb of Teti-Neb-Fu belonged to a period when the Old Kingdom was approaching a dramatic transformation. The great age of pyramid building had already produced some of humanity's most extraordinary monuments. But the political system that created them was changing. The authority of the pharaoh was weakening. Regional officials were becoming more powerful, and the centralized structure of the Old Kingdom was beginning to fracture. Teti-Neb-Fu may have lived through this unstable period. If he truly served the royal court, he could have witnessed something extraordinary. He may have treated people connected to the palace while the political world around them was changing. He may have watched powerful officials struggle for influence. He may have seen the final generations of the Old Kingdom attempt to preserve an order that was slowly disappearing. And then, sometime after his death, his tomb was entered, perhaps by thieves, perhaps more than once. Whatever happened, the body disappeared, but his name remained. And this is where archaeology becomes almost philosophical. What is left of a human being after 4,000 years? The body can disappear. The possessions can disappear. The house can collapse. The civilization can vanish. But a name carved into stone can survive. The Egyptians understood this better than almost anyone. They did not simply write names because they needed labels. They wrote them because names mattered. The name was part of identity, and identity had to be preserved. This may explain why Egyptian tombs contain so many repeated inscriptions. The deceased had to be named, again and again. The offerings had to be identified. The gods had to be identified. The rituals had to be identified. Everything had to be correct. Because according to their beliefs, an error could have consequences. The words themselves were part of the protection, and some of those words were extremely specific. There were spells designed to prevent the deceased from losing their heart. Others protected the body. Some allowed the dead to transform into animals or other sacred forms. Some gave the deceased knowledge of divine names. Others helped them pass through gates. The ancient Egyptian afterlife was not simply a peaceful garden waiting at the end of a tunnel. It was a complex landscape. There were dangers. There were obstacles. There were beings who had to be addressed correctly. And there were rules. This is why some funerary texts sound strangely practical. They don't simply say, "Go to heaven." They tell the deceased what to say, what to avoid, who to recognize, which name to use, which spell to recite. It is almost as if the Egyptians believed the afterlife had a language of its own. And if you didn't know that language, you might not make it through. That idea sounds supernatural to us, but there is another way to understand it. The ancient Egyptians were trying to prepare for something no living person could verify. Nobody could return from death and provide a reliable map. So they built one themselves. Generation after generation, priests recorded what they believed. They combined religious traditions. They preserved rituals. They copied older texts. They adapted them for new rulers and new periods. And over thousands of years, these traditions evolved. This is why Egyptian funerary literature is so valuable. It doesn't just tell us what Egyptians believed about death, it tells us how those beliefs changed. And sometimes, the changes are revealing. The earliest royal funerary texts are among the oldest religious writings known from ancient Egypt. Later, similar ideas appeared on coffins. Eventually, collections of spells appeared on papyri. The message evolved, but the central fear remained. The dead needed protection, and perhaps the most important protection of all was knowledge. Knowledge of the gods, knowledge of the rituals, knowledge of the sacred words, knowledge of the path, and knowledge of what waited at the end. But there was another type of knowledge that ancient Egyptians guarded carefully. Knowledge about the human body. Because if Teti-Neb-Fu's titles tell us anything, they suggest that ancient Egyptian healers had accumulated an impressive understanding of disease and treatment. They knew that plants could heal. They knew that injuries required careful attention. They understood that teeth could deteriorate. They even developed ways to manage physical problems that would have been incredibly difficult to treat in their time. But they did not understand everything. They did not know about bacteria. They did not understand modern anatomy. They believed the heart played a role in thought and emotion. They could observe symptoms without understanding the microscopic causes behind them. And yet observation itself was powerful. They watched. They recorded. They experimented. They passed knowledge from one generation to another. And that knowledge eventually found its way onto papyrus and stone. This is why the inscriptions of ancient Egypt are so important. They are not merely religious relics. They are fragments of human memory, a medical formula, a physician's title, a prayer, a warning, a royal decree, a funeral spell. Each one is a tiny window into a world that would otherwise be completely lost. And when archaeologists uncover those fragments, they are not just reading words. They are reconstructing a civilization. But there is one question that still hangs over the tomb of Teti-Neb-Fu. Why was a man associated with medicine, protection, and the scorpion goddess buried with such powerful symbols? Was it simply part of his profession? Was it a ritual meant to protect him in the afterlife? Or did the inscriptions contain knowledge that was considered dangerous enough to require supernatural protection? We cannot know for certain. But ancient Egypt gives us another clue. Because across its temples and tombs, one idea appears again and again. Knowing the right words could mean the difference between safety and destruction. And once you understand that, the ancient hieroglyphs stop looking like pictures. They start looking like instructions. Instructions written for someone who believed they would wake up on the other side of death. And if those instructions